Good morning. Welcome to the August 2018 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, could you please announce our agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. First, you will consider a public notice establishing application and bidding procedures for auctioning upper microwave flexible use licenses in the 28 gigahertz Auction 101 and 24 gigahertz Auction 102 bands. Second, you will consider a further notice of proposed rulemaking proposing an auction mechanism that would transition existing spectrum holdings in the 39 gigahertz band to a new flexible use band plan and would offer new licenses for contiguous spectrum in the band. Third, you will consider a report and order that would allow one-touch make-ready for most pole attachments and further reform its pole attachment process, and a declaratory ruling that will conclude that Section 253A prohibits state and local moratoria on telecommunications facilities deployment. Fourth, you will consider a notice of inquiry on creating a Universal Service Fund pilot program to promote the use of telehealth services among low-income Americans. Fifth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking and order that begins the process of eliminating Congress' directive in the Reimbursement Expansion Act that the Commission reimburse certain low-power television translator, and FM broadcast stations for costs incurred as a result of the Commission's broadcast television spectrum incentive auction. Sixth, you will consider a report and order establishing the requirements which will govern an Incubator Program that seeks to promote the entry of new and diverse voices into the broadcast industry. This is your agenda for today. Please note item 7, a personnel action as listed on the Sunshine Notice of August 1st, 2018, was adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. We will begin with an item presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau entitled Auctions of Upper Microwave Flexible Use Licenses for Next Generation Wireless Services, Minimum Opening Bids, Upfront Payments, and Other Procedures for Auction 101 and 102. And Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, will give the introduction.
Sounds good. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you the Spectrum Frontiers Auction Procedures Public Notice. I am joined at the table today by Joel Taubenblatt, Bill Huber, and Eric Byte. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank everyone listed on the slide for their input. Eric will now present the item.
Thank you, Don. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today's public notice would establish application and bidding procedures for 2 auctions of approximately 6,000 upper microwave flexible use service licenses in the 28 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz bands. As established in the Spectrum Frontiers orders, the 1.55 gigahertz of spectrum available in these auctions would be licensed on a geographic area basis, with the 28 gigahertz licenses offered as 2 425 megahertz blocks by county, and the 24 gigahertz licenses offered as 7 100 megahertz blocks by partial economic area. The public notice would adopt the proposal to offer these licenses through 2 auctions with separate application and bidding processes for each auction. The public notice would confirm that bidding for the 28 gigahertz band, designated as Auction 101, is scheduled to commence on November 14th, 2018, and bidding for the 24 gigahertz band, designated as Auction 102, will be scheduled to commence after the conclusion of bidding in Auction 101. The auction of the 28 gigahertz band, Auction 101, would employ the Commission's standard simultaneous multiple round auction format. This format offers every license for bid at the same time and consists of successive bidding rounds in which bidders may place bids on individual licenses. The auction of the 24 gigahertz band, Auction 102, would employ a clock auction format, which would allow bidding on generic blocks in each PEA in successive clock bidding rounds. The clock phase would be followed by an assignment phase to allow winners of generic blocks to bid for frequency-specific license assignments while ensuring contiguous block assignments. The Auction 102 format would be similar to the forward auction portion of the broadcast incentive auction. The public notice would also adopt the proposal for separate application filing windows, one for Auction 101 and one for Auction 102, and would conclude that the two initial filing windows would run concurrently. As a result, the public notice would establish that certain of the Commission's auction rules, such as the prohibition on certain communications, would apply across both auctions, given that parties wishing to participate in either auction would be applicants during overlapping periods of time. In addition, the public notice would adopt proposed bidding credit caps of $25 million for small businesses and $10 million for rural service providers. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this public notice and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Byth, for that presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's public notice outlines the auction procedures for the 24 and 28 gigahertz auctions. It puts the final few pieces of the puzzle in place, and potential auction participants should now have the necessary information to make business plans and finalize auction strategy before the first of these auctions begin in November of this year. I applaud the chairman's efforts to move these spectrum proceedings and auctions expeditiously with additional details for other bands to come. Auctions 101 and 102 present unique issues that we've not dealt with in prior auctions. To state the obvious, these are the first auctions for flexible use licenses in millimeter wave bands. Therefore, it is challenging to determine the appropriate upfront payments and minimum opening bid prices, as there's no comparable auction upon which we can base these decisions. In response to our initial proposal, several parties asserted that the upfront payments and minimum reserve price were too high for smaller markets based on recent secondary market transactions and the projected high cost of millimeter wave build-outs in rural areas. Accordingly, we are adopting a three-tiered approach suggested by these commenters. However, I do have some concerns that this approach could result in issues arising from reduced bidding eligibility and licenses being sold too cheaply. I hope we've hit the right balance, but if we find that there are significant problems, we'll need to review our approach prior to the 24 gigahertz auction. This is also the first time they'll be holding consecutive auctions with the Commission's confidentiality and anti-collusion rules applying to both at the same time. I know that this is not popular with some and recognize that this poses some legitimate problems. Not only will this seriously curtail certain conversations between industry participants for a prolonged period during the auctions, but also the Commission will have to withhold some information for a longer period than normal. However, I am hopeful sufficient information will be available to applicants to formulate auction strategies based on the short-form applications, the detailed round results with bidder names masked, and the data on specific licenses being sold, along with winning gross bid for each soon after the close of the auction. In the future, we must have greater capability to run multiple auctions at the same time or conduct auctions for more markets and licenses, ending such problems. Moreover, our anti-collusion rules and major modification prohibitions make it uniquely challenging for those with pending merger applications before the Commission to participate in these auctions. I expect that the Commission will expedite consideration of any petitions regarding such issues and will provide parties with answers prior to opening the short-form application windows in September. Finally, I find it necessary to note, although I won't object here, that the item unnecessarily retains spectrum aggregation limits for the millimeter wave bands. I will vote to approve the item, and I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. November 2018 will be an important month for millions of Americans. It'll mark the start of the FCC's first new auction of 5G spectrum. And with this public notice, we announced the final procedures that will govern bidding for the 24 and 28 gigahertz bands. Admittedly, this public notice dives into arcane rules pretty quickly. Simultaneous multi-round auction format doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But what this means for our country, thanks, Nick, appreciate that. One laugh out of that line. What this means for our country in plain terms is more broadband, more jobs, and more money back to the Treasury. The first of these auctions will begin on Wednesday, November 14. The news that day might mention that the FCC is holding an auction, that it has something to do with 5G, and that it might net billions of dollars back to taxpayers. What the news probably won't mention is the tremendous effort that went into preparing for that day. And those of us on the 8th floor could certainly speak more often and more loudly about the work of the dedicated staff throughout the building. Consider, for instance, the legwork it took to prepare these two bands for auction. In 2017, the Wireless Bureau analyzed whether our existing spectrum aggregation rules made sense in the upper bands. The Bureau then updated licenses in our electronic system to reflect the new band plan. In 2018, the Bureau clarified our build-out rules for this spectrum so they remain meaningful when applied to the Internet of Things. Earlier this year, the Bureau resolved spectrum sharing concerns, especially for fixed satellite services, as well as operability requirements. And it coordinated across the agency to test our application and bidding systems to make sure they're ready for auction. Each of these can be thorny, technical, and time-consuming issues, but they're key to conducting a successful auction. This was hard work. So as we approach auctions that will make the news, the FCC staff deserves the credit for the thousands of hours they've put in on this and other auctions. Work that's always going on, but often flies under the radar. So to the staff here and to all those that you put up on that slide, we want to say thank you. Thank you for your efforts on all this. One laugh, one clap. I'm doing pretty well here. That's good. So enjoy that limited but deserved recognition. But be warned, your work obviously doesn't stop here. The FCC has been supercharging the agency's efforts to free up more spectrum. In February, we paved the way for opening up spectrum above 95 gigahertz. In March, we sought comment on designating the 4.9 gigahertz band for flexible use. In April, we took steps towards bringing over 1.5 gigahertz of millimeter wave spectrum to auction. In May, we started a proceeding to put the 2.5 gigahertz band to potentially more productive use. In June, we finalized rules for the 24 gigahertz band and sought comment on opening up the 26 and 42 gigahertz bands. In July, we sought comment on clearing more mid-band spectrum, and Chairman Pai has announced the auction of spectrum in the 37, 39, and 49 gigahertz bands. That's in addition to the work we're doing today in the 28 and 24 gigahertz. It's a lot of gigahertz. And in short, in the race to 5G, we're positioning the U.S. to win. We're 4 gigahertz ahead of second place China and making progress every day on both the spectrum and infrastructure necessary to win the race. This PN is part of that effort, so it has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
It's been 25 years since the Federal Communications Commission was granted auction authority. In that quarter of a century, this agency has held about 90 auctions, issued more than 44,000 licenses, and raised more than $114 billion for the United States Treasury. More recently, we blazed a trail for incentive auctions by testing the proposition that existing spectrum licensees might voluntarily relinquish their rights in exchange for a portion of the proceeds from the subsequent re-auction of their airwaves for new flexible use. As a result, our efforts have been a model for regulators worldwide. Today, we tackle another frontier with our first ever auction of high-band spectrum dedicated to the deployment of 5G wireless services. This is exciting. It's another one for the history books, and as I said back in January, it is imperative that this agency hold an auction this year. I'm glad my colleagues listened, because it starts right here with the auctions we announce in this public notice. However, it's time to recognize something fundamental. Our auction playbook needs an update for the 5G era. The power of this distributive tool in the future requires that we do more today than simply rely on the tools of auction past. That's because as our national providers grow bigger and fewer in number, the success of our future auctions depends on growing a new class of spectrum interests that can join the ranks of those who bid on airwaves and come up with innovative new ways to use them. Moreover, I believe a few of our key decisions today rest a little too comfortably on the auction practices of the past. Let me explain. To prepare for this auction, we sought comment on how to schedule filing windows for the 28 and 24 gigahertz auctions. The record was unanimous. Every commenter told us not to schedule concurrent filing windows. And yet today we do just that. We also sought comment on the timing of our auctions. Again, the record was clear. Commenter after commenter told us that including the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands in the 24 gigahertz auction would minimize bidder risk and increase the likelihood of auction success. They cautioned us not to auction the 24 gigahertz band on its own. And yet, today we do just that. In addition, we heard from parties about the urgency of mid-band spectrum opportunities. Commenters of all stripes suggest moving ahead now is key, as mid-band spectrum auctions are already happening abroad, and the United States risks falling behind. And yet, we are haphazardly scheduling high-band auctions without a full public calendar and a clear plan to auction mid-band spectrum. I think going forward, we should be bold. We should be willing to divert from the stale practices of the past and develop auction policies that take into full account the spectrum realities of the present. In some respects, today's decision does that, yet in others, it simply does not. But because it does the most important thing for our future spectrum success, it gets an auction started. I will offer my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Today we take another crucial step towards satisfying the ever-increasing demand for more spectrum and for solidifying American leadership in 5G, the next generation of wireless connectivity. In particular, we finalized the procedures for 2 spectrum auctions. The 28 gigahertz band auction will begin on November 14th, and soon after its conclusion, the 24 gigahertz band auction will start. The 1.55 gigahertz of spectrum in these 2 high bands will be critical in deploying 5G, wireless, Internet of Things, and other advanced spectrum-based services and applications. Maintaining leadership in wireless technologies is critical for our country. It will boost economic growth, job creation, and national competitiveness. And given that the world is going wireless, it will dramatically improve the consumer experience, including in ways we can't even conceive today. With the auction procedures we adopt today, we seek to promote competitive bidding, to make it easier for applicants to participate, and to assign high-band spectrum licenses as efficiently as possible. All of this will enable the Commission to get this valuable spectrum into the marketplace and put it to its highest valued use. Now, as Commissioner Carr mentioned, this is the latest in a long line of FCC efforts to make high-band spectrum available for flexible wireless use. Efforts like the 2017 and 2018 Spectrum Frontiers orders. And we're not stopping with these 2 auctions. As has been mentioned, in the second half of 2019, we intend to hold an auction of 3 more millimeter wave spectrum bands, 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz. And between that auction and the auctions for which we establish procedures today, we will push almost 5 gigahertz of spectrum into the commercial marketplace over the course of the next 17 months. We're also reforming our wireless and wireline infrastructure rules to ensure that the small cell and fiber-based networks of the future can be built. For all the 5G spectrum in the world is pointless without 5G networks to make use of it. These are the kinds of aggressive actions that we need to take to promote innovation, investment, and United States leadership in 5G. Many thanks to the staff who have contributed to this complicated item, from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the International Bureau, the Office of Managing Director, and the Office of General Counsel, and in particular Eric Byth for a presentation as strong as the mustache. I don't think we've seen the likes of that in some time. Thank you for the great work on this item. With that, we will call for a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Votes aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
And the chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. With that, Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on the agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the second item on your agenda, entitled Use of Spectrum Bands Above 24 Gigahertz for Mobile Radio Services, will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction again.
All right, Mr. Stockdale, we again turn the microphone over to you.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, next I am pleased to present to you the Spectrum Frontiers fourth further notice of proposed rulemaking. I am joined at the table today by Joel Taubenblatt, Eric Salavara, Blaise Cinto, Martha Stansel, and Catherine Schrader. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank in particular Evan Correll and Paul Lafontaine from the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis, and everyone listed on this slide for their input. Eric will now present the item.
Thank you, Don. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Today's fourth further notice of proposed rulemaking seeks comment on how best to transition existing spectrum holdings in the 39 gigahertz band to the new flexible use band plan in a manner that will promote the efficient use of this spectrum by incumbents and new licensees for 5G wireless, Internet of Things, and other advanced services. The 39 gigahertz band, combined with the upper 37 gigahertz band, offers a critical opportunity for 5G deployment, as it represents the largest amount of contiguous spectrum available for flexible use wireless service in the millimeter wave bands. The proceeding seeks to facilitate the reconfiguration of existing 39 gigahertz spectrum holdings, currently licensed in small spectrum block sizes and mismatched geographic areas, into more contiguous swaths of spectrum that are conducive to wireless broadband deployment, including 5G services. The reconfiguration of incumbent 39 gigahertz holdings would protect and enhance incumbents' existing spectrum usage rights and would increase opportunities for the Commission to offer new licenses of contiguous spectrum blocks at auction. To accomplish these goals, the fourth notice proposes several key steps. First, it proposes to modify the 39 gigahertz block size to 100 megahertz in order to simplify the transition from existing license holdings to reconfigured holdings. Similarly, it proposes to modify the upper 37 gigahertz and 47 gigahertz band plans from 200 megahertz to 100 megahertz channels to facilitate the auctioning of all three bands at the same time. In addition, the fourth notice proposes an incentive auction to reduce encumbrances and create contiguous blocks of spectrum throughout the 39 gigahertz and upper 37 gigahertz bands, thereby maximizing the bidding options for incumbents and potential new entrants. The proposed incentive auction would use a clock auction format in which new entrants and incumbents could bid on new licenses, and those bids for new licenses would determine the incentive payments offered to incumbents that choose to relinquish existing spectrum usage rights. Thus, the auction would serve simultaneously as the forward and reverse components of the incentive auction. The clock phase of the auction would be followed by an assignment phase to award frequency-specific licenses in the new band plan. After the auction, incumbents that chose to relinquish their spectrum usage rights to make new licenses available would receive incentive payments. The fourth notice also proposes methods that would allow incumbent licensees to consolidate and rationalize their encumbered license holdings before the proposed incentive auction to better align their existing licenses with the proposed band plan. Further, the fourth notice seeks comment on potential methods to repack the licenses of incumbents that do not participate in the incentive auction. The steps proposed in the fourth notice are intended to enable the Commission to auction much of the combined 2,400 megahertz in the upper 37 and 39 gigahertz bands as near nationwide contiguous spectrum in a single generic block clock auction. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this fourth further notice and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salavar, for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a longer statement I'll submit, but I'll make a couple points. Today's notice of proposed rulemaking makes some rule tweaks to harmonize licensing across the 3 bands mentioned, but the majority of the item will facilitate discussion about the best means to rationalize or reduce encumbrances in the 39 gigahertz band. The NPRM proposes a mechanism using an incentive auction, vouchers, and a repacking process to enable the greatest amount of clean, contiguous spectrum to be auctioned for 5G networks. Of course, if it were only as easy as it sounds. Some of the possible voucher and repacking concepts are novel, complex, or just a tad confusing. To analogize, this effort is a little like trying to trade monopoly properties. Here, it is not only trading with the co-players, but also with the bank. And to make things even more complicated, an entity may currently hold only a portion of some of these properties because the current licensees do not hold their licenses in 100 megahertz blocks as proposed in the item in partial economic areas market size. So if an entity tries to trade 25% of interest in St. James Place, half of New York Avenue, and 75% of Illinois Avenue, does that equate to all of Boardwalk? Well, this is very simplified. These are the types of questions that confront the Commission. Obviously, we still have a lot of work to do to solidify all the necessary details. As we figure out specifics, we must ensure that incumbents are made whole, the maximum amount of contiguous spectrum is available for auction, and the process is as simple as possible so that we can finish this review, obtain any required software, and take the necessary pre-auction steps in time to meet the 2019 timeline. I approve this item, and I look forward to discussing these issues with interested parties in the coming months. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Millimeter wave spectrum can give our country a boost towards winning the race to 5G. Particularly when it's allocated in wide channels, the spectrum is well suited to the high throughput and low latency that are hallmarks of next-gen networks. Taken together, 2 of the bands at issue here offer 2,400 megahertz of spectrum. In one, the 37 gigahertz band, there's no commercial wireless, and in the other, the 39 gigahertz band, the Commission has about 1/3 of the spectrum sitting unused in our inventory. So what's holding us up? The short answer, as indicated by Commissioner O'Reilly, is the 39 gigahertz band is messy. It's fragmented in terms of geography and frequency, and that's due to its history. In the 1990s, companies sought licenses for what was known as wireless local loop service. The wireless companies defined their own license boundaries using rectangular service areas, or RSAs. By the late 1990s, the wireless local loop business wasn't panning out, and so the Commission announced an auction to encourage more intensive use of the band. But this only added more complications. To start, the FCC auctioned 50 megahertz pairs of non-contiguous spectrum. It then licensed this spectrum over large economic areas on the condition that winning bidders protect existing RSAs nested inside the EAs. And so it remains today, with 50 megahertz pairs scattered across the band and a Swiss cheese map of overlapping geographies, including more than 700 licenses that are encumbered. Through this notice, we take steps to clean up the mess and reflect changes in technology. We propose to do so by clearing and auctioning the spectrum modeled on our broadcast incentive auction. This process can maximize the number of 100 megahertz channels in the band, return revenue to the Treasury, and help the United States win the race to 5G. So I want to thank the Wireless Bureau again for its work on this notice. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Oklahoma City, Atlanta, and Raleigh are just a few of the cities that will see the start of 5G wireless this year, powered by the 39 gigahertz spectrum that is the subject of this rulemaking. But before we can realize the full potential of these airwaves, we have some cleaning up to do. To ensure big swaths of this spectrum are available for auction in the not too distant future, we need a framework to address existing encumbrances. Accordingly, today's rulemaking proposes an incentive auction in which incumbents would receive vouchers in exchange for current licenses. This approach is critical because holding an auction with the existing fragmented band would result in higher costs and deployment delays. I appreciate that here my colleagues have agreed to auction the revamped 39 gigahertz band along with spectrum in the 37 and 47 gigahertz bands. This is the right way to go. Going forward, we should put a premium on auctioning 5G bands together instead of offering them one by one. I also appreciate that the chairman has agreed to my request to permit incumbents in the 39 gigahertz band to use their vouchers to acquire new spectrum rights in any of the millimeter wave bands we will auction here. By granting bidders greater flexibility, we can generate more interest in the auction and allow bidders the ability to assess which bands work best for them. In other words, a more thoughtful auction will result. This rulemaking has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. As part of our strategy to extend U.S. leadership in 5G, we intend to hold a single auction of 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz spectrum bands in the second half of 2019. This auction will make available 3.4 gigahertz of millimeter wave spectrum for the commercial marketplace, including 2.4 gigahertz of contiguous spectrum. But not all of this spectrum is ready to be auctioned. In particular, there are too many incumbent interests in the 39 gigahertz band, and efforts to resolve these encumbrances voluntarily haven't solved the problem. And this calls upon the FCC to act. And act we will. Specifically, we propose today to hold an incentive auction to resolve the encumbrances in the 39 gigahertz band. As we have heard, incumbent 39 gigahertz licensees will be able to sell their old licenses and receive vouchers that they can then use to purchase new licenses in the upper 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz band auction. This market mechanism will eliminate the encumbrances while maximizing bidding options for incumbents and new entrants alike. Moreover, we propose to reconfigure the band plan for the upper 37 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz bands from 200 megahertz blocks to 100 megahertz blocks, which will make it easier for us to hold a simultaneous auction of these three bands. Now, this elegant solution may seem as novel as the bands to which it is being applied, but it has a distinguished pedigree, dating back to the famous 1959 paper in which Ronald Coase made the proposal, radical at the time and a bedrock principle today, that the FCC simply allocate spectrum through competitive bidding. And so many thanks to the staff who have embraced this aspect of the Coase theorem and have contributed to this much needed item from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, from the Office of General Counsel, and from the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve?
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the fantastic work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 3 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 3, entitled Accelerating Wireline Broadband Deployment by Removing Barriers to Infrastructure Investment, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Kamo, the microphone is yours. Sorry?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a third report and order and declaratory ruling on accelerating wireline broadband deployment by removing barriers to infrastructure investment. This item, if adopted, will promote the deployment of broadband infrastructure by speeding the process and reducing the costs of attaching new facilities to utility poles, and by making clear that Section 253A of the Communications Act prohibits state and local moratoria on deployment of telecommunications services or facilities. I would like to thank the terrific team in the Wireline Competition Bureau for their hard work on this item. I also thank our colleagues in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, as well as the Enforcement Bureau and the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel for their valuable input and support. Seated at the table with me from WCB's Competition Policy Division are Daniel Kahn, Division Chief, Adam Copeland, Deputy Division Chief, and Anique Bonon, Attorney Advisor. Anique will present the item.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This third report in order and declaratory ruling is the next step in the Commission's efforts to remove regulatory barriers that increase costs and inject unnecessary delay to the deployment of network facilities. The report and order, if adopted, will ensure that access to this vital infrastructure is swift, predictable, safe, and affordable, so that broadband providers can continue to enter new markets and deploy facilities that support high-speed broadband. Streamlined pole access is also essential to the race for 5G because mobile and fixed wireless providers are increasingly deploying innovative small cells on poles, and these high-speed wireless services depend on wireline backhaul. This report and order adopts a new framework for the vast majority of pole attachments governed by federal law by instituting a one-touch, make-ready regime. Under this regime, a new attacher may elect to perform all simple work to prepare a pole in the communications space. One-touch, make-ready will speed up and reduce the cost of broadband deployment by allowing the new attacher, the party with the strongest incentive to prepare the pole, to perform all work rather than spreading the work across multiple parties. The one-touch, make-ready regime includes safeguards to promote coordination among parties and ensures that new attachers perform the work safely and reliably. The report and order retains a multi-party process for new attachments that are complex or above the communication space of a pole, where safety and reliability risks are greater. At the same time, it makes significant modifications to the existing process to speed deployment. The report and order includes other improvements to the Commission's pole attachment rules. It codifies and redefines Commission precedent that requires utilities to allow attachers to overlash existing wires, maximizing the usable space on the pole. It eliminates outdated disparities between the pole attachment rates that incumbent carriers must pay compared to other similarly situated cable and telecommunications attachers. And it makes clear that the Commission will preempt, on an expedited, case-by-case basis, state and local laws that inhibit the rebuilding or restoration of broadband infrastructure after a disaster. The declaratory ruling, if adopted, will conclude that state and local moratoria on the deployment of telecommunications facilities are barred by Section 253A of the Communications Act, and that moratoria are generally not protected by the exceptions in Section 253B or C. The Wireline Competition Bureau and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges, extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Banu, for that excellent presentation. Is that your first in
It
open
is.
meeting? Very well done. Welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. I believe there's near universal agreement, certainly among my colleagues here at the FCC, that broadband services of sufficient functionality should be available to all Americans that seek access. If used properly, broadband can bring enormous benefits to individuals and society as a whole. From critical news and information to educational materials and entertainment, broadband can improve the lives of our citizens in ways not imagined just decades ago. It is completely interwoven into almost every aspect of business and the commercial world. And the technologies in the works and on the drawing board suggest there'll be astronomically more connected universe. Persistent and known obstacles, however, are preventing many Americans from accessing private sector broadband services. In many cases, the economics make it incredibly challenging to extend network build-outs to the farthest corners of our nation. It's why I've spent so much time working to modernize and strengthen the Commission's Connect America Fund and have pushed hard for the initiation of the Remote Areas Fund. Similarly, A large percentage of state and local governments are due kudos for stepping forward to make the process for obtaining broadband deployment approvals, to the extent that it's necessary, more efficient. At the same time, a select group of state and local governments have defied reasons and actually slowed down or stifled deployment work to feed their own egos, power, or push for shakedown bounties. This is unacceptable. Today, the Commission takes its second step in our larger effort to confront the practices of these bad actors. This has been an over 30-year fight with some of these communities and associations representing them, so you'll excuse me if I don't buy the arguments that it takes more cooperation and time working together. Will I support the one-touch make-ready provisions? I want to start my comments on the second portion of today's item, the moratoria section. Anyone who has worked in this space for quite a while knows that state and local governments have been on notice for decades that Congress wanted to end moratoriums on wireless towers and antennas and to tower siting decisions based on aesthetics. Let me make this clear for those local officials who may not have been listening in the past. No moratoriums, no moratoriums, absolutely no moratoriums. It is beyond me that we are still having to deal with this outrageous practice after so many years, especially given how important broadband can be to the very citizens residing in these areas. In addition to the existing provisions of Section 332, today's item declares 253 as a statutory authority for prohibiting applicable moratoriums. While I know it will be challenged in court, my simple reaction is hallelujah. Every ounce of congressional authority provided to the Commission must be used as a counterforce against moratorium, which is just another word for mindless delay or extortion attempts to generate some local official's wish list. And the record is replete with examples of such out-of-bound practices, such as digital inclusion funds that unnecessarily create political slush funds and raise the cost of service for consumers. Turning to the first portion, I want to thank the chair and his team for making a few key edits to the one-touch make-ready provisions. My revisions will not fundamentally alter the direction of the item or undermine its necessary effects. Instead, it will smooth some rougher parts of the OTMR by bolstering the recourse for damages or non-compliance resulting from OTMR work, ensuring that make-ready work damage to existing attachers' facilities are rectified immediately, increasing post-OTMR inspection periods, allowing existing attachers to continue work on their networks during the advance notice period, reducing the burdens of per-pole estimates and invoices, permitting overlashing of facilities upon permission of the host without the pole owner advanced approval, amongst others. In the end, the item will be greatly efficient in helping the private sector expand broadband throughout America, producing a more competitive and capable nation. I look forward to further actions later this year by Commissioner Carr to further extend wireless build-out efforts, including other preemption measures to complement our work here today. I will vote to approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The first utility poles in the country, as you may know, went up not far from here back in 1844. They formed a 38-mile line between the U.S. Capitol and the Mount Clair Railroad Station in Baltimore. The poles went up along a right-of-way used by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The idea came from an engineer, Ezra Cornell, who'd been working with Samuel Morse on a way to quickly and efficiently string a telegraph line between 2 points. With the poles and wireline in place, Morse and his partner, Alfred Vail, were able to send the world's first long-distance telegraph on May 24th, 1844. And, Mr. Chairman, do you know what the content of that very first telegraph was?
Hello.
Close. We'll let people look that up. We won't tell them what the answer is.
Merry Christmas.
What hath God wrought, actually, is the answer.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
Prescient.
It was very prescient. So the humble utility pole is one of the oldest forms of infrastructure used for communication. And it is that same utility pole that will support the next-gen networks of tomorrow. Take 5G. We need thousands of new small cell deployments over the next few years. And the lion's share of these are expected to go up on utility poles in rights-of-way. You can already see the leading edge of these deployments in communities across the country. I've seen it in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where city officials showed me some of the small cells that have gone up across their downtown. I've seen it on top of a wooden pole outside a high school in rural Woodstock, Virginia, where a small cell is adding the capacity needed to power students' coding classes and cloud-based learning. At the FCC, we've been working to streamline and reduce barriers to these small cell deployments. And today's decision is another good step in that direction. By making it easier for providers to safely and efficiently attach broadband-capable fiber and cable lines to utility poles, we can bring down the cost of the backhaul needed to connect all these small cell deployments. In this decision, we also take the common sense step of repeating our longstanding view that moratoria on telecom deployments violate federal law. This decision will provide even greater certainty as we look to promote next-gen deployments in communities across the country. So I want to thank the Wireline Bureau, the Wireless Bureau as well, for their work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
In this country we build, we are a nation of doers. Clearing the obstacles in our way is deep in our DNA. I believe this instinct has served us well, and over time there has been a lot of evidence this is true before the Federal Communications Commission. You see it in the way as a country we connect it all through the public switch telephone network. You see it in the way we led the world in the deployment of 4G wireless service. You see it, too, in the cities and towns that are clamoring for better broadband service because they know that without it, their communities will not have a fair shot in the digital age. You also see the influence of that spirit in this decision. It is designed to expedite access to utility poles. That may not seem grand at first blush, but clearing the way to access these lowly facilities is a big deal. It means building more broadband in more places, more competitive broadband, and enhanced access to the next generation of wireless services. For this reason, I support one-touch make-ready pole attachment. By allowing for the modification of replacement of the lines or equipment on a utility pole to accommodate additional facilities, I believe we can speed the way to a future with more digital age infrastructure deployment across the country. But as with all things, the devil is in the details. We are dealing with a complex and heady mix of federal authority, state preemption, local realities, and the possibility of job losses for workers and service outages for consumers. Getting it right is essential. I believe that in some ways, this decision runs roughshod over the details when clearer and more specific direction is required. First, in a rush to put out rules, this agency accepts too much ambiguity in the one-touch, make-ready regime we adopt today. Ideally, these policies would be crystal clear, so there are no disputes about just what deployments qualify for one-touch, make-ready procedures. But I am concerned that is not the case here. And I believe this is going to slow down deployment, not speed it up. Indeed, even determining what counts as simple make-ready work is not so simple. That's because our definitions of simple and complex processes do not provide enough real-world guidance to attachers and utilities, setting the stage for disputes and delays. Worse, we decide not to give any voice in this process to the parties that are arguably well-positioned to make some of these tricky determinations, the existing attachers. This is hard to justify. Second, we could do more to protect jobs and safety. By giving short shrift to employees covered by collective bargaining agreements, this decision threatens to invalidate private contracts negotiated between existing attachers and union workers. But going forward, this agency could put those employees out of work. That's not right. Moreover, it's not an outcome that we can simply ignore. Third, we should give more thought to what happens to existing attachers on poles. With only superficial analysis, we conclude that existing contract and tort law will protect their interests. This is not so simple because in many cases there is no privity of contract between these parties. One-touch make-ready regimes and the public at large would be better served by mechanisms that would allow existing attachers to hold a new attacher or contractor accountable for the consequences of performing shoddy work, especially when they could lead to consumer outages. Finally, I fear that for all of our desire to expedite deployment, all this decision will do is speed the way for litigation. Nowhere is this clearer than in the declaratory ruling. This agency determines that state or local requirements that prevent or have the effect of suspending the processing of siting applications for new communications infrastructure violate Section 253A of the Communications Act and are preempted. The legal analysis here is seriously lacking. A basic canon of statutory interpretation requires that this agency give meaning to all relevant portions of the law. Interpretations that support statutory consistency are valued over those that do not. And yet there is no way to square this declaratory ruling regarding Section 253A with Section 253D. That's because Section 253D provides the express mechanism for this agency to preempt state and local requirements on a case-by-case basis after notice and opportunity for public comment. Moreover, our interpretation of 253A preemption all but reads Section 332C out of the law, which provides a specific due process remedy for the failure to act on wireless facility siting. So what does all this mean in the real world? Well, take Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, for example. It's a coastal community. There are laws that limit the ability of private entities to dig up roads during certain times of the year, namely during the height of hurricane season and during peak tourist times. These rules are limited in time and scope. They are informed by local traffic and public safety authorities. They're reasonably related to the police powers of municipalities. And yet, going forward, 3 unelected officials sitting here today preempt these local policies because they believe Washington knows better. This is unfortunate, because I believe we need smart one-touch make-ready policies and others like it to expedite the deployment of more broadband and wireless services in more places. We need to find a modern way to balance the needs for national deployment policies with local realities so that across the board, government authorities support what we need everywhere, and that's digital age infrastructure. I believe there is a thoughtful way to do this, but the reasoning in today's decision falls short. While I approve our adoption of one-touch make-ready policies in concept, the deficiencies in our analysis are too significant for me to offer my full support. As a result, I approve in part and dissent in part.
Thank you, Commissioner. Last year, I visited Detroit. Now, some long ago wrote off the Motor City, but as I saw for myself, there's an unmistakable energy and optimism to the place. Part of the reason why is Rocket Fiber. This small startup is aiming to provide high-speed, high-quality internet access to residents and increase competition along the way. From a boxing ring to a mobile van that they use to sign up customers, I could feel the enthusiasm for the company's work and by extension for the city's future. But Rocket Fiber faces some big hurdles, among them the difficulty of attaching its broadband equipment to utility poles. For a competitive entrant, especially a small company, breaking into the market can be hard, if not impossible, if your business plan relies on other entities to make room for you on those poles. Today, a broadband provider that wants to attach fiber or other equipment to a pole first must wait for and then pay for each existing attacher to sequentially move existing equipment and wires. This process can take months, and the bill for multiple truck rolls adds up. For companies of any size, pole attachment problems represent one of the biggest barriers to broadband deployment. And all of this got me thinking about a policy that would allow a single entity to do the requisite work on the utility pole, a policy commonly known as One-Touch Make-Ready, or OTMR. Now, today we adopt OTMR in order to help accelerate broadband deployment and competition across the country, helping to close the digital divide. Now, OTMR promises to substantially lower the cost and shorten the time to deploy broadband on utility poles. It allows a new provider who wants to attach to a pole to move all the wires and equipment in just one touch. It's a bit like having to go to the grocery store, the dry cleaner, and the bank. Now, the slow way to do this would be to go to each of these locations and then come back home after each trip. But the rational thing we all do after these errands is to bundle them together, to do all of them at once. And that is essentially what One Touch Make Ready is. Also, we make clear today that it is a violation of federal law for states or localities to impose moratoria on broadband deployment. There may be reasonable ways local governments can regulate network deployments in their jurisdictions, but blocking competition and denying better services for American consumers are not among them. Now, to be sure, there have been some objections raised to this One Touch Make Ready policy. For example, one objection has been that we should require stronger indemnification provisions to existing attachers beyond the steps we already take on this front. But that objection has no resonance in the record, according to many commenters. For example, Google Fiber responds, and I quote, "This proposal presses for changes that would tilt the playing field even further toward existing attachers. In particular, the call for broad third-party indemnification of existing attachers by new attachers would expose new attachers to potentially unbounded liability, and without any corresponding benefit." Similarly, we have heard an objection that there would be a negative impact on jobs and that we therefore should not do anything that arguably could implicate collective bargaining agreements. But here too, the record is on balance against this objection. Here too, Google Fiber says, and I quote, "No other proposal is more self-serving than the insistence that new attachers be obligated to honor existing attachers' collective bargaining agreements. Google Fiber has no problem using union contractors that have been approved by the pole owner. But the reality is that in many areas, no such contractors exist. Instead, in some of these places, the only union members covered by collective bargaining agreements are the employees of existing attachers." Finally, we have also heard the objection that that we should allow an existing attacher to object broadly to a contractor's determination that make-ready work is simple or complex. But here too, the record is against it. Google Fiber responds, and again I quote, "Adoption of this proposal would gut One Touch Make Ready by giving existing attachers the power to decide when One Touch Make Ready can be used. This would perpetuate the existing power imbalance in which incumbent attachers have the ability to delay and even prevent deployment of new networks by competitors. By allowing existing attachers to both unilaterally determine whether Make Ready is simple or complex, this proposal would obliterate those few remedies available to new attachers under the current system and would destroy new attachers' ability to have any control over the timing of their own deployment." In sum, based upon a thorough and complex review of the record, this is why this commission is looking forward, not backward. This is why we are favoring competition, not the status quo. This is why we are embracing the promise of new entrants that want nothing more than a chance to compete in the marketplace, not sticking with the way things are because of fears that are all too often an excuse for finding a way to say no. Now, we would not have arrived on this pro-competitive path without the tireless work of the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, or BDAC. One of the major recommendations from the BDAC's work was that the Commission should adopt a one-touch make-ready regime. And I am pleased that today's order largely follows the path that was prescribed by the BDAC. Now, I know that there were many long hours of debate and plenty of genuine disagreements, but at the end of the day, the BDAC was able to coalesce around a solid and balanced policy. Now, I promised the members of the BDAC early on that they would not just be marking time, and I stood by my word. Make Ready is not make work. It is a major step forward toward better, faster, and cheaper internet access for all Americans. Lastly, I want to thank the staff who have worked so hard on this item, from the Wireline Competition Bureau the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis. Your work on this item was terrific, and the proof will be in the pudding with better services across the country in the time to come. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the fantastic work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 4 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item on your agenda, entitled Promoting Telehealth for Low-Income Consumers, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. Once again, Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you. And Ms. Monteith, we turn the floor over to you again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, before the Bureau begins its presentation, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Karen Rubin, a leading expert in telehealth, who will give a brief presentation on this important topic. Dr. Rubin.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. I'm Karen Rubin, and I direct the Center for Telehealth at the University of Virginia, a HRSA-funded telehealth resource center serving 9 states and the District of Columbia. In addition, I'm a practicing pediatric cardiologist, and equally appropriate to this item, I'm the current chair of the board of Virginia Medicaid. Joining me are 2 second-year medical students serving as UVA telemedicine fellows and 2 members of my team. We have Dustin Lowry and Duncan Carlton, Samuel Collins and Lauren Purnell in the front row, the next generation of telemedicine. Advances in telehealth technologies and remote patient monitoring have transformed care delivery models by improving access, mitigating workforce shortages, and enabling new models of chronic disease management. Nearly 75% of healthcare costs are spent on chronic illness. Broadband is essential to the delivery of telemedicine and connected care. Increasingly, connected care is being delivered outside the walls of healthcare facilities, where patients live, where they work, and for children where they attend school or attend daycare. The UVA Center for Telehealth was established in 1995, just prior to the passage of the Act. We've relied upon the Rural Healthcare Program to facilitate connectivity to many of our 150 partner healthcare facilities across the Commonwealth of Virginia, from Appalachia to the Eastern Shore. We've reduced the burden of travel for Virginians by more than 18 million miles of driving, saved lives, facilitated improved care by offering services in more than 60 different subspecialties of healthcare. As a safety net hospital, we also work closely with Virginia Medicaid to pilot innovations in healthcare using advanced technologies. As you may be aware, or perhaps not, Medicaid not only supports the care of children and pregnant women, but also the aged, the blind, and the disabled, along with patients with substance use disorders and behavioral health conditions. The same is true for the Veterans Health Administration. 6 years ago, UVA developed remote patient monitoring and care coordination programs designed to prevent hospital readmissions and reduce the burden of chronic illness. Hospital readmissions rates have been reduced significantly for many conditions, and outpatient management of chronic disease has improved by increasing patient engagement and coordinating care between the patient and their primary and specialty medical homes. Some examples. Our diabetes remote monitoring program has improved outcomes in the setting of a federally qualified health center in Appalachia by combining virtual training in diabetes self-management with remote monitoring tools at home. We track a host of metrics to include hemoglobin A1C levels, a marker for blood sugar levels and complications of diabetes. A level of 6.5% or higher indicates diabetes. In our study population of patients with poorly controlled diabetes, over a 6-month period, the mean hemoglobin A1C level dropped from 9.9% to 7.7%. Via telemedicine, those same patients have received nutritional counseling and screening for diabetic retinopathy, the #1 cause of blindness in working adults. Our heart failure remote monitoring and care coordination programs for high-risk patients have reduced 30-day readmission rates by 82% and emergency room visits by 77%. The cost savings are estimated to be 7 times the program's cost. for an illness that costs our nation more than $31 billion annually. We use remote monitoring technologies to care for fragile organ transplant patients and dialysis patients at home so as to provide timely interventions. We manage medically complex infants and children after hospital discharge with video-enabled tablets and an array of FDA-approved peripheral devices that transfer vital signs and other important patient data to the patient's electronic medical record for review by the clinician. In short, investing in telemedicine is a win-win proposition as it saves lives and reduces costs. But the benefits today do not reach all Americans. As the FCC Connect to Health Task Force and its critically important searchable database have demonstrated, there are many rural communities where broadband availability still is limited and health status indicators unfavorable. Thus, rural, low-income patients with chronic illness who lack access to affordable broadband are unable to benefit from innovations in connected care. It's time this changed, and the FCC's proposed pilot program can help lead the way. We enthusiastically support the creation of the proposed Universal Service Connected Care pilot program and urge the Commission to align the program with other federal efforts to improve patient care, reduce health care costs, and improve population health. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, and thank you very much, Dr. Rubin, for that very informative presentation. Turning to the item before the Commission, the Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a notice of inquiry that seeks comment on creating a connected care pilot program to support the delivery of advanced telehealth services to low-income Americans. Many thanks to the Wireline Competition Bureau team for their work on this proceeding. Our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel also provided us with valuable input. With me at the table are Trent Harkrader, Associate Chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau, Kate Dumochel, Acting Chief of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Rashawn Duval, Acting Deputy Chief of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division, and Ariel Roth, Legal Advisor. Ariel will now present the item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The FCC's top priority is to improve digital opportunity for all Americans, and nowhere is that imperative more critical than in the healthcare realm. Broadband-enabled telehealth services are becoming increasingly important in providing care, and advances in telehealth technologies are now enabling patients to receive connected care everywhere. Whether through remote patient monitoring technologies or mobile health applications accessible on connected devices, patients are seeing better health outcomes and significant cost savings through high-tech care that can be delivered to them directly regardless of their physical location. All Americans should have access to these connected care services. However, many low-income consumers, in particular those living in rural areas, lack access to affordable or adequate broadband and may be unable to benefit from these and other advanced telehealth technologies. If adopted, this notice of inquiry would explore launching a Universal Service Fund pilot program to support the delivery of connected care services to low-income families and veterans. The item would seek comment on the goals of this connected care pilot program, the Commission's statutory authority for establishing it, and the program structure, including the program budget, the application process, and types of pilot projects that should be funded, the eligibility criteria for participants, the services that should be supported, the amount of support and how it should be dispersed, and the program's duration. Finally, the item would seek comment on measuring the effectiveness of pilot projects in achieving the program's goals. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Roth, for the presentation. And Doctor, thank you and your colleagues for coming here today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the informative presentation that explained that work. And perhaps most importantly to my parents, who still hold out some hope that I'll go to medical school. Thank you for presenting the impact that doctors using technology can have in the 21st century. We will now proceed to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From the outset, I want to commend my colleague, Commissioner Carr, for picking up and running with a critical matter after the departure of Commissioner Clyburn, who championed this issue during her tenure. Having spent a portion of my past career focused on healthcare, and specifically on healthcare technology, I am very aware of just how incredibly complex and intertwined the overarching problems can be. From licensing to funding to jurisdictional lines and overall inertia, improving America's healthcare system is not for the faint of heart and isn't something you can just dabble. I know Commissioner Carr realizes how all-encompassing healthcare technology can be and is up for the task. Similarly, working within the bounds of the FCC's universal service programs can be equally complex, especially since they are made explicit by Congress. These programs have served to help connect consumers and communities that would not otherwise have access to modern communications networks. Accordingly, it is not surprising to see a desire to expand their scope to other aspects of our incredibly connected lives. At the same time, there are certain statutorily, fiscal, and practical limits on this agency's mission that keep us from engaging in certain areas no matter how compelling a particular idea might be. My goal is to ensure that any new program is legally sound, coordinated both within the Universal Service Fund and with other agency programs to avoid duplication, cost-effective for consumers and businesses that would fund it, and accountable to the agency and the American public. This notice of inquiry does raise some concerns along those lines, which I'll touch on briefly. First, I've been skeptical of the agency's authority to conduct pilot programs, particularly those that involve beneficiaries, services, and equipment not already authorized by law. At a minimum, I suspect we may need to pare back the scope of any such pilot project as this. Devices and ambulances, just to name two, seem far out of bounds. Second, we must avoid duplicating other USF spending, such as funding connectivity in a community that may already be subsidized or targeted through the high-cost program. Third, any new program should complement, not replicate, the multiple of other existing federal telehealth initiatives. The item is short on outlining and explaining what programs already exist, but if healthcare agencies have expertise in patient monitoring and fund equipment or apps, we shouldn't do the same. Instead, we must consider ways to sufficiently target our dollars to specific needs like connectivity and leverage our respective authority, capability, and funding. Fourth, our telemedicine programs can significantly reduce expenses for other healthcare programs and entities, but the Commission is not able to recognize any of these savings. For example, it is well known that patient monitoring can help avoid emergency room visits and hospital readmissions. We need to take a deep dive to understand the size of these savings and must conduct extensive coordination with other programs so these savings can be reinvested in our programs to minimize the impact on telephone ratepayers. USF must not be used as a tax collector for telemedicine. This is of particular interest to me, and I intend to engage personally on the subject. Fifth, and relatedly, having just substantially increased the rural health care program cap, we must carefully consider the impact of additional spending on consumers, their businesses, and businesses who would pay extra on their phone bills to support it. I've called for an overall cap on USF to ensure that we discuss the benefits and trade-offs whenever spending changes are contemplated. This must be part of our future actions. Finally, as with any USF program, I want to ensure that it's targeted to unserved, not underserved areas, that the selection mechanism is efficient and technology neutral, like via reverse auctions rather than beauty contests, and that appropriate safeguards are put in place to deter waste, fraud, and abuse. For our purposes today, the NOI is a very wide-ranging presentation of many issues that need to be considered and is sufficiently broad to be worth my support. I thank Commissioner Carr for getting us to this point, but we both recognize much work lies ahead. I commit to rolling up my sleeves to address these matters and others consistent with my principles before any notice of proposed rulemaking is considered. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Dr. Rubin, great to see you again. Also want to recognize two of your team members, Dustin and Duncan, and thank both of you for your military service. Much appreciated, very grateful for all that you've done. Turning to this item, James served in the Navy for 24 years. He worked in aviation, including on C-130s, transporting troops and cargo all over the world. While on operation in 2013, James suffered a spinal cord injury. As a service-disabled vet, James is now under the active care of the VA. Now, this used to mean a 2-hour drive from his home in California to the nearest VA facility multiple times a month. With his injury, those long drives were never easy, and weather conditions often made the trip impossible. But James is now one of the many veterans who are part of the VA's innovative Connected Care program. It's a picture of him there with his service dog, Samantha, who's always with him. The program allows him to stay home and visit virtually with a range of VA specialists over a secure video connection, which he can set up on his tablet or smartphone. We had the chance to talk earlier this week over that video connection. In addition to video visits and other remote care technologies, James gets a text message every morning reminding him to check his blood pressure, which is then recorded in an app. The first few times he measured his blood pressure, a VA nurse used the video connection to ensure he had the cuff on right and took the measurement accurately. Now his doctors at the VA can remotely track his blood pressure numbers and intervene if they're out of range. This has cut in half his need to make those long trips to the VA. He now enjoys the chance to travel the country in his RV while using his tablet to stay in touch with his VA team. He said, "This is huge. I can only imagine the potential of the technology." James' story is part of a new trend in telehealth. It's a trend towards connected care everywhere. The delivery of high-tech, high-quality care is no longer limited to the confines of connected brick-and-mortar facilities. Remote technologies, whether enabled by a smartphone, tablet, or other device, are bringing high-quality, affordable care to communities across the country. Take the Mississippi Delta, which is ground zero for the country's diabetes epidemic. It sees diabetes at rates that are about twice the national average. Ruleville, Mississippi is no exception. It's where I met Miss Annie, a patient at the North Sunflower Medical Center. She noticed the first signs of her diabetes when she woke up one morning with blurred vision. After seeing little progress managing her diabetes with traditional care options, Miss Annie signed up for a remote patient monitoring pilot program. She walked me through the iPad and the Bluetooth-enabled blood glucose monitors that patients use in their homes to track and control their own care on a daily basis. The tablet chimes every morning as a reminder. Miss Annie then pricks her finger and her A1C level is displayed on the screen. The app suggests appropriate actions from a particular food or exercise to watching a relevant video. If she forgets to enter her numbers that day, she'll get a phone call from a nurse. With this technology, Miss Annie's A1C levels have gone down, and she says she's never felt better. Remote patient monitoring technologies can take many forms. They can monitor blood pressure, pulse, temperature, fetal heartbeats, oxygen levels, weight, and blood glucose levels, not to mention the psychology, dermatology, and other clinical services that can be provided to remote locations over a video connection. In fact, the technologies are now being used to treat up to 60 different conditions, including opioid dependency. And they can help bridge the growing doctor divide that plagues many rural communities. But challenges remain. For instance, the VA often has funding to purchase the tablets necessary for remote patient monitoring, but there are limits on its ability to fund the broadband connection. So that might be one area where the FCC could help get more projects up and running. Limited broadband deployments in rural areas is another challenge. James, the Navy vet, said that he installed a consumer signal booster in his home so that he could get an LTE signal strong enough for his virtual visits to work. So promoting new deployments might be another benefit of our pilot program. There are also many Americans for whom the cost of a high-speed connection is out of reach. By targeting this pilot to low-income patients, we can ensure that every community benefits from remote patient monitoring technologies. To be sure, the pilot program won't solve every challenge. There are licensing and reimbursement issues that are beyond our expertise. But we're coordinating with the VA, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and private providers. The FCC has long played a role in supporting broadband deployments to brick-and-mortar healthcare facilities. So I think we should explore whether we can support this new trend in telehealth as well. Given the significant cost savings and improved patient outcomes, we should align public policy in support of this movement in telehealth. So I'm glad that Chairman Pai has asked me to lead this new telehealth initiative. He's been a strong supporter of this effort from the get-go, no doubt due to growing up in rural America, the son of 2 doctors. Had an impact. And I want to thank my colleagues, Commissioner O'Reilly and Commissioner Rosenworcel as well as the members of Congress who've all offered ideas and support for this new initiative. I look forward to continuing the discussion with all stakeholders as we work to stand this program up. Finally, I want to thank the Wireline Competition Bureau for their work, especially Rashawn Duvall, Kate Dumichel, Trent Harkrader, and Ariel Roth, as well as my old stomping ground, the Office of General Counsel, for its significant contributions. And I also want to recognize Jamie Suskin in my office, who put a lot of thought and effort into developing this program, and to Nurali Patel in the chairman's office, who played a lead role in preparing the notice that we're voting on today. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
According to the American Hospital Association, 60 million Americans, 1/5 of the population, live in rural communities. But crisscross the country, and you will learn that many of those millions in remote areas lack access to the most essential health care. Take pregnancy. For any woman who is pregnant, having a hospital delivery room nearby means knowing that when the baby arrives, medical assistance will be at hand. For too many women in rural America, this comfort's no longer available, and it is putting too many births at risk. The facts are stark. More than 179 counties across the country have lost obstetric care in hospitals during the past decade and a half. As a result, 54% of rural counties can no longer have a hospital with a maternity ward. As a mom myself, I can attest that giving birth is hard work, but it gets more difficult if every meeting with a healthcare professional to monitor everything from blood pressure to blood sugar is far from home. Routine appointments with healthcare providers can be all but impossible when they require a full day of travel, time off from work, foregone wages, and cobbling together special arrangements for childcare. And yet failure to monitor the small things during pregnancy can have big consequences. They can lead to serious problems in childbirth. And in the United States, the maternal mortality rate is going up. In fact, this is the only country in the industrial world that has seen an increased rate of maternal deaths in the last several years. The loss of obstetric services in rural areas may be a driving force behind this statistic. That's because the most common causes of serious pregnancy-related complications are avoidable with regular monitoring and medical care. What is happening with pregnant women in rural communities is a piece of a larger story. In remote areas, the cost of offering service is high relative to the revenues sparsely populated areas can generate. That difficult math creates vulnerabilities for rural Americans as hospitals close, facilities shutter, and doctor and nursing shortages grow more acute. These problems impact not only obstetric services, but also diabetes and cancer treatment. They pose challenges for stroke patients. They create hurdles with those with mental health difficulties and dependency on opioids. In fact, any condition that benefits from regular monitoring becomes a special challenge when reliable care is neither nearby nor easy to access. Of course, these difficulties are by no means limited to the most remote areas. They are present in low-income communities everywhere. That's not only a fact I know from the sources that my colleagues cite in today's inquiry. It's one I know from childhood. You could say it's in my blood. That's because my father served in the Air Force as a physician. And after he left the service for civilian life, he practiced medicine. For 3 decades, he ran a low-income city clinic for hypertension and kidney failure. Growing up, dinner conversations were about chronic disease, dialysis, and the challenges of securing reliable care for those least likely to afford it. Of course, not one of us here on this dais is a doctor. Not one of us is a nurse, nor are we healthcare authorities. But we sit here today because more than 2 decades ago, Congress charged the Federal Communications Commission with making telecommunications available to health providers in rural areas. And in the intervening years, this agency has developed 2 programs. The first program, known as the Telecommunications Program, is laid out in detail in the Telecommunications Act. Section 254H1 directs the agency to support public or nonprofit healthcare providers in rural areas by offering funding for telecommunications services to the extent that rates are higher than those charged for similar services in urban areas. The second program, known as the Healthcare Connect Fund, is of more recent vintage. Pursuant to Section 254H2, it offers support for high-capacity broadband through state and regional healthcare provider networks. To be eligible for support, more than half of the sites served need to be from rural areas. And this second program got started as a pilot program. Today, we propose a new pilot program, and there's a lot of good that can come from this if we do it right. At the outset, it is terrific that the agency is looking at healthcare programs in a modern way. It is important to build a record that reflects how connected care is changing and how remote patient monitoring technologies are evolving. I firmly believe the FCC can play a role in expanding how communications is used in treatment to improve healthcare outcomes. I particularly appreciate that my colleagues were willing to add multiple questions about the state of obstetric care in rural communities to this inquiry, and I want to thank them for that. But now let me add a note of caution. We need to be honest about the legal ground on which this proposal rests. For starters, it does not neatly fit into the statutory scheme of the programs we have for health purposes under Section 254. Those programs are designed to serve healthcare providers in rural areas. This inquiry speaks more broadly and contemplates subsidizing service to patients in their home in areas that may or may not be rural. The statutory authority available for doing this is the Lifeline Program. The Lifeline Program is older than our healthcare programs. In fact, it began nearly 3 decades ago. When it was established, communicating required a telephone with a cord and a jack in the wall. Some of us here might remember that. And back then, it helped support the cost of voice calling in low-income households. And today, it continues to help those in need by supporting access to low-cost communications. However, the program has been changed in a significant way. It's been modernized to support wireless service. And nationwide, millions of Americans rely on the Lifeline program for communications. But last year, this agency announced plans to gut the service for 70% of current users. To the extent there are problems with companies abusing this program or enrolling those who are ineligible, we're going to have to fix them. But I believe there are ways to do this without harming those who need and rely on Lifeline. Instead, however, this agency has destabilized this program with its proposal with what I think is a cruel disregard for the people across the country who could be harmed by those actions. Let me just quickly review who they are. We can start with the roughly 20,000 men, women, and children across the country who call a domestic violence hotline every day. 77% of domestic violence prevention programs distribute phones to help those who truly need a lifeline for safety. We can note that there are more than 500,000 Americans who live on Puerto Rico who rely on the Lifeline program for basic communications. In the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, they used this program to reach out for emergency assistance, call their loved ones, seek health care, and coordinate recovery. Nearly a year later, 1 in 5 residents continue to count on this program for basic communications. We can note that there are 650,000 homeless young people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. They are at special risk of bullying, discrimination, and assault. And as research from the University of Southern California demonstrates, access to communications, including through Lifeline, helps homeless youth in impossibly tough circumstances because it helps them find and support networks, reach potential employers, and access health care. Let me also point out that there are more than 1.3 million veterans who have honored us with their service, who now rely on the Lifeline program in their civilian life. Moreover, we've encouraged their participation by expanding the program to cover those who participate in the Veterans Pension as part of an effort to help former service members and their families in need. And one more data point. There are nearly 2.2 million senior citizens who rely on Lifeline for communication service. Age, of course, brings new healthcare challenges, but it is going to be hard to improve access to telemedicine when this agency is simultaneously pursuing policies that strand senior citizens without basic communication service. So before this agency decides to give out $100 million in grants for new healthcare pilot program, it's got to answer for those actions. It has to recognize that it has destabilized communication services that millions of Americans rely on today. It cannot borrow from the authority of the Lifeline program for a new project without first reconciling the damage it is proposed to do to those who already depend on it. To be clear, that does not undermine the good we propose here. The possibilities of improving care for rural Americans, low-income Americans, and let me end where I started, pregnant Americans, are real. But we have a lot to do before we make that happen, and I hope my colleagues will commit to rolling up their sleeves and working with me to do it.
Thank you, Commissioner. In a 1962 episode of the futuristic animated series The Jetsons, Elroy complains to his mother, Jane, that he's come down with what he calls Venus virus, and he can't go to school. A skeptical Jane summons the family physician through the push of a button. Within seconds, Dr. Racy appears on a video phone to examine Elroy, saving the family a trip to his office. As it turns out, shockingly, Elroy was simply looking for an excuse to skip his space calculus exam that day. Well, over half a century later, this scene is no longer fantasy. Indeed, the FCC chairman, back when that Jetsons episode aired, the famed Newton Minnow, has made waves in recent years, explaining how telehealth, of all the broadband applications, can make the biggest and most positive difference in American society. He and I recently collaborated to discuss these advances in communications technology. We talked about the children in Scottsville, Kentucky, a town I visited this year, where the nearest pediatrician is almost 30 miles away. Thanks to a high-speed broadband connection, doctors from Vanderbilt University's Children's Hospital can now examine Scottsville students on a video screen and give them an immediate diagnosis. And telehealth services today go well beyond visits to the virtual doctor, as the former chairman and I observed. Patients can use remote monitoring and mobile health applications through connected devices to track their health and receive care wherever they are. Augusta Health, a hospital in rural Stanton, Virginia, uses technology to remotely monitor patients who have left the hospital, dramatically reducing the incidence of sepsis. The Cleveland Clinic deploys a mobile stroke unit with advanced wireless capability in order to assess and stabilize a stroke patient 38 minutes more quickly than before, which is vital considering that a stroke victim loses 2 million brain cells every minute. And as highlighted in a November 2017 White House report, telemedicine can connect opioid patients to caregivers when there is no other option, with wearable biosensors detecting real-time drug use and alerting a first responder or a family member to intervene. Now, broadband-enabled health services like these can significantly improve Americans' health and reduce costs for patients and for healthcare providers alike. But many low-income consumers, especially those in rural areas, lack access to affordable broadband and may not be able to realize these benefits. Well, that's why we are launching this initiative today, to figure out how the FCC can support the delivery of connected care to low-income consumers. Specifically, we are exploring a program to promote the use of broadband-enabled telehealth services among low-income families and veterans, with a particular focus on services delivered directly to patients beyond the doors of brick-and-mortar healthcare facilities. We're asking for public input on the goals of and the statutory authority for this connected care pilot program, as well as how best to design that program. I would like to thank the many healthcare providers, healthcare facilities, and healthcare professionals over the past year and a half who have opened their doors to illuminate the promise of telemedicine to me, from Idaho to Ohio. I would also like to thank Commissioner Carr for his leadership on this notice of inquiry. He and his staff have put a tremendous amount of work into this effort, and I look forward to working with him and the rest of my colleagues to bridge this critical gap in the digital divide. Last but certainly not least, thank you to the dedicated FCC staff who worked on this item. Kate Dumichel, Rashawn Duvall, James Eisner, Jody Griffin, Trent Harkrader, Chris Monteith, Ryan Palmer, Eric Ralph, Ariel Roth, Craig Stroup, Tracy Walden, and Roger Wook of the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Melina Barzilai, Ashley Boisel, Richard Mallon, and Linda Oliver of the Office of General Counsel. A healthier America is a better America, and you are helping to make this possible. That's no small thing. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. And thanks again to our visitors for participating today. Madam Secretary, can you take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fifth item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled LPTV, TV Translator, and FM Broadcast Station Reimbursement, Expanding the Economic and Innovation Opportunities of Spectrum Through Incentive Auctions. And Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Media Bureau presents a notice of proposed rulemaking and order that proposes rules to implement the Congress's recent directive in the Reimbursement Expansion Act that the Commission reimburse low-power television, TV translator, and FM stations for costs incurred as a result of the Commission's broadcast television spectrum auction. Pursuant to this act, the Commission must complete a rulemaking adopting a reimbursement process for LPTV, TV translator, and FM stations by March 23, 2019. The item before you initiates this process. Joining me at the table are Barbara Kreisman and Maria Malarkey of the Media Bureau and Jean Cadieux of the Incentive Auction Task Force. Maria will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this notice of proposed rulemaking and order that implements the Reimbursement Expansion Act. When Congress authorized the Commission to conduct the incentive auction as part of the 2012 Spectrum Act, it required the Commission to reimburse certain costs incurred by full power and Class A stations that were reassigned to new channels as a result of the auction, as well as certain costs incurred by MVPDs to continue to carry such stations. In the REA, Congress expanded the list of entities eligible to be reimbursed for auction-related expenses to include LPTV, TV translator, and FM stations, and provided additional funds to the reimbursement fund to be used for this purpose. The REA also increased the funds available to reimburse full power and Class A stations and MVPDs, and provided funds to the Commission for consumer education efforts. The REA appropriated a total of $1 billion to the reimbursement fund, $600 million in fiscal year 2018, and $400 million in fiscal year 2019. As an initial matter, the MPRM seeks comment on how to interpret the statutory provisions that relate to the $400 million appropriated for fiscal year 2019, and specifically on whether these funds are available to reimburse newly eligible LPTV, TV translator, and FM broadcast stations, in addition to full power, Class A, and MVPD entities. With respect to eligibility for LPTV and TV translator stations, the MPRM tentatively concludes that LPTV and TV translator stations are eligible for reimbursement under the REA if 1, they filed an application during the Commission's special displacement window and obtained a construction permit, and 2, were licensed in transmitting for at least 9 of the 12 months prior to April 13, 2017, as required by the REA. The MPRM tentatively concludes that the equipment and other costs necessary for an eligible LPTV or TV translator station to construct the facilities authorized by grant of the station's special displacement window application shall be considered eligible for reimbursement under the REA. With respect to eligibility for FM broadcast stations, the NPRM tentatively concludes that both full-power FM stations and FM translators that were licensed and transmitting on April 13, 2017, using the facilities affected by a repacked television station are eligible for reimbursement under the REA. The NPRM proposes that this will include FM stations that incur costs because they must permanently relocate, temporarily or permanently modify their facilities, or purchase or modify auxiliary facilities to provide service to at least 80% of their primary station's coverage area or population during construction work on a repacked television station's facilities. The NPRM proposes to reimburse up to 100% of costs for FM stations that must relocate permanently or temporarily or permanently modify facilities. The NPRM seeks comment on a graduated, prioritized system to reimburse FM stations for the cost to purchase or modify auxiliary equipment to avoid going silent as a result of the repacking process. With respect to the reimbursement process for eligible LPTV, TV translator, and FM broadcast stations, the NPRM proposes to use a procedure that is substantially similar to that currently being used by the Commission to provide reimbursements to full-power, Class A, and MVPD entities. The NPRM proposes that LPTV, TV translator, and FM broadcast stations seeking reimbursement file with the Commission a certification that they meet the eligibility criteria, information regarding their current broadcasting equipment, and an estimate of costs eligible for reimbursement. The NPRM also proposes to establish strong measures to protect against waste, fraud, and abuse with respect to disbursements to LPTV, TV translator, and FM stations, similar to the Commission's current reimbursement program for full-power, Class A, and MVPD entities. Finally, the item includes a companion order that directs the Media Bureau to engage a contractor to assist in the reimbursement process for newly eligible entities, and directs the Bureau to make certain determinations regarding the reimbursement process. It also discusses the Commission's use of the funds provided by the REA for consumer education. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this notice of proposed rulemaking in order and requests editorial privileges that extend to any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Malarkey, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to make a couple comments, and I'll submit my longer statement for the record and just say I appreciate that the Commission is starting the implementation of work that Congress required of us, and I appreciate the Chair's help in working on a couple components, specifically on radio and education outreach with me, and hopefully those will be improved as we move along the process, and I thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. In the Spectrum Act, Congress recognized the need to make more spectrum available for mobile broadband through the broadcast incentive auction. Congress also recognized that broadcasters should be reimbursed for costs they incur in the repacking process. But the Spectrum Act imposed limits on the FCC's authority to reimburse the more than 2,000 LPTV stations and TV translators that could be impacted by the repacking process, as well as hundreds of FM stations. Congress addressed this issue in the Reimbursement Expansion Act, which passed this year. In it, Congress allocated additional funding and gave the FCC authority to reimburse LPTV, FM stations, and translators. This is an important step that can help keep many of these stations on the air and minimize disruptions in service associated with the repack. Today's notice begins the process of implementing those decisions. This additional funding will help keep diverse voices on the air and help the many rural and remote communities that rely on these stations for emergency alerts and information. I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on the notice. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I am going to forego a statement on this one, but thank the Bureau for their work on this rulemaking. It has my full support.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will have a short statement, which is my entire statement, which is simply to say thank you for the staff for implementing this legislation, or for kicking off the process of implementation, and thank you as well to Congress for passing this legislation, which provides additional reimbursement funds for full power and Class A stations, reimbursement funds for newly eligible LPTV and TV translator and FM stations, and funds for the FCC to use for consumer education purposes. It was not an easy effort, but nonetheless, we appreciate the work that you and our colleagues in Congress have done to get us here. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Votes aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the last item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the sixth and final item on your agenda will also be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Rules and Policies to Promote New Entry and Ownership Diversity in the Broadcasting Services. Once again, Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mrs. Carey, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item the Media Bureau presents is a report in order establishing requirements for an incubator program to increase ownership diversity in the broadcast sector. Joining me at the table are Brendan Holland, Radhika Carmarker, Jamila Best-Johnson, and Christopher Clark of the Media Bureau's Industry Analysis Division. Jamila will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the order before you establishes the requirements for an incubator program that seeks to increase broadcast ownership opportunities for new entrants and small broadcasters, including women, minorities, and struggling station owners. This comprehensive incubator program addresses the key obstacles to ownership and operation of broadcast stations, namely lack of access to capital and lack of technical, operational, and management experience. The program addresses these barriers by pairing established broadcasters with new entrants or small or struggling broadcasters. The goal of the program is to encourage new independent broadcast owners or to enable struggling broadcasters to operate on a firmer footing at the successful conclusion of an incubation relationship. The Media Bureau will evaluate applications for the incubator program and monitor these relationships during the incubation period. The order establishes requirements that will govern the incubator program, including the following provisions. First, the program will initially apply to the radio industry, as, among other reasons, the costs of obtaining and operating radio make the radio sector the most accessible entry point for entities with limited capital resources and operational experience. Second, the order adopts a two-pronged eligibility standard that combines a modified version of the Commission's existing new entrant bidding credit standard, long used in broadcast auctions, with the revenue-based eligible entity definition contained in the Commission's broadcast rules. An incubated entity must also certify that absent the incubation relationship, it could not pursue its broadcast station ownership goals. Requiring incubated entities to meet these standards will help ensure that those receiving incubation are truly new or small broadcasters in need of assistance. Third, the order requires that incubation relationships provide the incubated entity with the support that it lacks and that will ultimately enable it to own and operate its own station independently. Fourth, the order requires that incubation relationships last for 3 years, but allows parties to seek approval from the Media Bureau either to conclude their relationship early or extend it for up to an additional 3 years. In return for successfully incubating a new, small, or struggling broadcaster, the established broadcaster will be eligible to receive a waiver of the local radio ownership rule, including the AM/FM subcaps, for either the market in which it performed the incubation or a comparable market. The item finds that this incentive has the best chance of encouraging established station owners with the requisite financial means and expertise to assist new, small, or struggling entities in overcoming the obstacles to independent ownership and operation of a radio station. We anticipate that today's order, by addressing the critical barriers to independent station ownership and operation, will promote diversity of ownership in the broadcast sector. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the report and order and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chair. I commend the chairman for bringing to order the Incubator Program he officially proposed in November after years of previous advocacy. The number of women-owned and controlled broadcast stations and the number of African-American-owned and controlled stations in the United States is abysmally low. These anemic statistics are a result of the FCC's longstanding archaic media ownership rules, which we took important steps in November to modernize. I truly believe that updating our rules to reflect the actual marketplace will allow broadcasters to compete and thrive. As I stated at the congressional hearing last October, our media ownership rules have not worked. We must try something new. Today, the Commission does just that as we set up the parameters for a radio incubator program. First, I want to thank the chairman for recognizing in the item that although the incubator program will offer reward waivers from certain aspects of our local radio ownership rule, including AM/FM subcaps, nothing in this item precludes the Commission from reconsidering these rules in future items. Specifically, sometime this year, the Commission will launch our 2018 Quadrennial Review. In that review, I will pursue an elimination or at least a drastically lift our AM/FM subcap restrictions. This item specifically confirms that our decisions today do not prejudge or speak to whether the current local radio ownership rules will be maintained or modified as a result of that review. We successfully eliminated the newspaper broadcast cross-ownership rule in November, perhaps a decade too late. We cannot rest on our laurels by maintaining the same regulatory climate for radio that helped seal the fate of so many newspapers. Next, I want to thank the chairman for reversing the draft's policy position on transferability. I believe that preventing the reward waiver from being freely transferable would harm participation rates and undermine sound policy. Once the incubator earns the benefit from a successful incubation, the reward waiver should apply, period. It should not matter whether the station owner ultimately receives the benefit, as it should not artificially expire if the station is sold to another individual. This was an important edit and again demonstrates that despite making our drafts publicly available in advance of our meetings, significant edits can still occur prior to our final approval of items. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues for accepting other minor edits I proposed, including jettisoning the use of delegated authority and clarifying the Commission's views on the previous success rate of the tax credits. I'm aware that some have suggested that we include a recommendation in our item that Congress adopt tax relief for incubation as an alternative to ownership waivers. Such an edit would do nothing but cause extensive delay and further continuation of the tragically low diversity ownership rates in the broadcast space. I also was unable to support altering the comparable market algorithm to disallow comparability more than 5 markets of rank above or removed from either direction in the incubated stations market. This is an overly complex alternative that I fear will restrict participation in the program. Finally, I could not support any report to Congress that revisits the overcoming disadvantages preference concept, as it is constitutionally flawed and more than problematic to implement. I truly hope that the incubation program we launched today is a success. I must admit that some questions do remain. For example, I wonder what will happen to incubators who take on an incubatee that is less than stellar. Will they be forced to pour resources into a company that simply cannot get off the ground? There is no easy answer for this other than the need for incubators to choose their incubatees wisely. Time will tell how much a factor this becomes. I will approve, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Anyone who has spent any time at a communications conference or in the tech space from New York to Silicon Valley knows that there's more progress to be made on diversity. For decades, the Commission talked about ways to help close the gap, including by establishing an incubator program to promote diverse voices in the broadcast industry. After years of inaction, today, we take a small but important step in the right direction. By providing the incentives for established broadcasters to incubate new entrants, we aim to address 2 longtime impediments to minority ownership: access to capital and operational experience. The average sale price for a radio station in 2016 was about $1 million, and new entrants and small broadcasters often lack the deep pockets necessary to get off the ground. So to incentivize incubators, this order will waive the local radio ownership rule for broadcasters who provide the necessary funding and training for a new entrant to stand on their own. And the program will include safeguards to prevent fraud and abuse. Maintaining the status quo isn't going to bring more diversity or new entry into the market. And the local radio ownership rule has remained largely unchanged since 1996. So I'm glad we're modernizing our rules to provide the right incentives to increase diversity in broadcast ownership. I look forward to seeing how this program develops and whether the lessons we learn from this approach can be applied more broadly. So I want to thank the Media Bureau for its work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
For decades, at the direction of Congress, the Federal Communications Commission maintained limits on the number of broadcast stations that a single company can own. These rules prevented a single entity from owning the top television stations in the same market. They also placed limits on the number of television stations and radio stations a single entity could control in any community. These policies were designed to sustain media diversity, localism, and competition. Those values may not be especially trendy, but I think they are solid. I think they support journalism and jobs. I think they play a critical role in advancing the mix of facts we all need to make decisions about our lives, our communities, and our country. In a decision late last year, the FCC dismantled those values. Instead of engaging in thoughtful reform that modernizes our rules, which we should do, it set our most basic values on fire. They are gone. As a result, wherever you live, the FCC has given the green light for a single company to own the newspaper and multiple television and radio stations in your community. I am hard-pressed to see any commitment to diversity, localism, or competition in that result. We should be troubled, because we're not going to remedy what ails our media today with a rush of new consolidation. We are not going to fix our ability to ferret out fact from fiction by doubling down on just a handful of companies controlling our public airwaves. We are not going to be able to remedy the way the highest level in government is now comfortable stirring up angry sentiment, denouncing news as false facts, and bestowing favors on outlets with narratives that flatter those in power, rather than offer the hard-hitting assessments we need as citizens. Despite all this, our policy changes have greased the way for mergers of ever greater magnitude, which, let's be honest, will not do a thing to make it more likely that women and minorities become owners of broadcast stations. As if to apologize for this setback, today the FCC offers the most modest of proposals. It will provide existing radio station owners with the right to exceed radio ownership limits if they offer a bit of aid to a qualifying new entrant in the market. There is nothing bold here. I fail to see how it will make a material difference in the diversity of media ownership. Its scope is too narrow, its consequences too small, and its impact on markets too muddled. Moreover, I fail to see how this will satisfy the Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, which on 3, count them, occasions has directed the FCC to take meaningful actions to address the shameful lack of racial and gender diversity in broadcast station ownership. Media ownership matters because what we see and hear over the airwaves says so much about who we are as individuals, as communities, and as a nation. Study a bit of history and you can only come to one conclusion. Consolidation will make our stations look less and less like the communities they serve. Women and minorities have struggled for too long to take the reins at media outlets. Because today's action will do too little to change that reality for too many who have waited too long, I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Everyone needs help from time to time, even the greatest among us. Hercules learned from Chiron, Luke learned from Yoda, Daniel learned from Mr. Miyagi, and Harry Potter needed to learn from Dumbledore before taking on Voldemort. Sometimes someone needs to show us the ropes before we venture out on our own. And that's a basic idea of an incubator program. Established broadcasters will pair with and provide support to small new entrants, including women and minorities, to help promote diversity of ownership in the broadcast sector. Relationships like these will help address the significant barriers that currently make it hard for many to enter the broadcast business, including lack of access to capital. Now, the idea of an incubator program has been discussed for decades. The National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters first advanced the idea to the FCC way back in 1990, and the FCC first sought comment on it in 1992. And in the last 26 years, the proposal has been discussed in no fewer than 7 different dockets. In fact, 4 years ago, I specifically proposed an incubator substantially similar to the one we adopt today, one supported by the Diversity and Competition Supporters, a group of public interest advocates. At the time, my proposal for an incubator was rejected by the prior administration, including the current minority, because it was too bold. The prior administration said it would, quote, pose substantial legal, administrative, and practical challenges, said it would not be feasible for the commission to monitor the activities that would qualify for a waiver, that it simply wasn't time. And to be sure, the prior commission talked a lot about supporting diversities. It did nothing. Indeed, it even let the Diversity Committee lapse into obscurity. So there's been a lot of talk on this subject, but talk doesn't get the job done. So this commission has adopted a different attitude, one borrowed from Elvis Presley. A little less conversation, a little more action. And action came at long last this past November when the FCC finally, under my leadership, agreed to adopt an incubator program. And today we establish rules for this program to get it off the ground. Under the procedures we are adopting, incubating entities will be able to pair up with small new entrants or existing struggling stations for a 3-year incubation period. Among other things, the incubating station will provide invaluable support to the incubated entity in the form of mentoring, financial, engineering and/or technical assistance, and operational support. The program will initially apply to the radio industry, as radio has traditionally been the most accessible entry point for new entities to enter the broadcast sector. And there's an appropriate incentive that is within our statutory authority to grant to incubating stations. For an incubating relationship to be deemed successful at the end of the 3-year period, the incubated entity must either own a new full-service radio station or its previous struggling station must be on a firmer footing. In exchange, if the incubation relationship is successful, the incubating entity can receive a waiver of the FCC's local radio ownership rule that it can use in the incubated market or a comparable market. Now, getting to this point, suffice it to say, took a lot of time, energy, and patience. In particular, I would like to thank the Advisory Committee on Diversity and Digital Empowerment for its hard work on this issue. I would also like to thank the FCC's hardworking staff who worked diligently for so long on this order. From the Media Bureau, Francesca Campione, Michelle Carey, Christopher Clark, Brendan Holland, Tom Horan, Jamila Best-Johnson, Radhika Karmarkar, Holly Sauer, Al Schuldener, and Sarah Weitzel. And from the Office of General Counsel, Bill Dever, Bill Scher, and Royce Sherlock. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Dissent.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the work on this item. Are there any announcements that my colleagues would like to make at this time?
Yes, and I ask my colleagues to bear with me. I have a resolution and ask the secretary to read.
Oh.
Okay.
Unprecedented.
Okay, I'm just going to admit I don't have my glasses. But
I'm sure you do a wonderful job.
Resolution, August 2nd, 2018. Whereas Ms. Bender first came to the Commission as an honors attorney in 2005 to serve in the Wireline Competition Bureau. Whereas over the last many years, Ms. Bender served various positions at the agency, including as legal counsel to 2 chiefs of the Wireline Competition Bureau, legal advisor to former Chairman Kevin Martin, and deputy chief in the Telecommunications Access Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau, where she managed the high-cost Universal Service Program, including the Connect America Fund. Whereas, for the last 4.5 years, Ms. Bender has served with distinction as Wireline legal advisor to Commissioner Michael O'Reilly, where she single-handedly taught the commissioner what little, in parentheses, he knows about the intricacies of wireline communications policy. Whereas, after nearly 14 years as a commission employee, Ms. Bender has decided to depart the agency for a new career opportunity. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the chairman and commissioners of the Federal Communications Commission, 1, do hereby acknowledge and salute the exemplary contributions of Ms. Bender to the agency and the American people, particularly those that have benefited from her sound judgment in helping to craft and implement the Commission's Universal Service programs, and 2, wish Ms. Bender enormous happiness and enjoyment in her new endeavors and more personal time with her husband and 2 amazing kids. This is the Federal Communications Commission honoring the work and accomplishments of Ms. Amy Bender upon her imminent departure from the agency.
I asked to be recognized on that point, if I could.
I'm afraid the resolution fails for lack of a second. Just kidding, go ahead.
I thank the chair. It's been a tough couple weeks for Team O'Reilly. As many of you know, 2 weeks ago, we celebrated the life of Bill Caldwell, husband to my former chief of staff, Rubin, after his valiant fight against cancer. But today, I'm here to wish my legal advisor, Amy, sincere thanks for agreeing to work with me almost 5 years ago and all the projects we've done in between. Amy and I have actually been debating for years the opportunity to offer such a resolution or an amendment at an open meeting, so this seemed like a perfect place to give it a shot. It's not actually prohibited by our rules, so it must be okay. As I've said before, if you like anything that I...
Only in this case.
Yes.
Yes.
If you like anything that I've ever done, it's because I have amazing staff like Amy, and if you disagree with me, it's because of me. In short, Amy is brilliant, dependable, family-driven, principled, loyal, and so many other words that I cannot rattle off today. She represents the epitome of a perfect team member, and I will miss her tremendously in her as she leaves us for a new opportunity. There'll be a toast in my office at 4 p.m. of champagne and apple cider, precisely at 4 p.m. for anyone who would like to attend who from internal the FCC. I know that she's not leaving as of this day, but I know that we head to summer and people will skedaddle, and so it's important that I raise this point where we all have a chance to thank her for her work, and I appreciate the chair's indulgence.
Here, here. Commissioner, oh, sorry, Commissioner O'Reilly, were you done?
Go ahead, I'll have another one.
All right. Well, this is a lot less formal. No reading responsibilities. No fine print. But Travis Littman, who serves as my senior legal advisor and chief of staff, now has an expanded family. On July 20th, his wife Allison gave birth to twins Elliot Charles and Adam Craig. And from all reports, the babies are healthy, his wife is fine, and their big sister Ellen is dealing with it. We wish him the best, and as the aunt of 2 sets of twins, I wish him luck with that sleep thing. And while he's gone, I am so excited to say that Betsy McIntyre will be in my office helping with the load. She is currently the Deputy Division Chief in the Competition Infrastructure and Policy Division of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. She also did a tour of duty in the Wireline Communications Bureau. And when I first got to know her, she worked for United States Senator Mark Warner. She first came to this agency as an honors attorney. She really does represent some of the best and brightest who come into public service, and I am so grateful to have her help, not just for this meeting, but going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Carr?
Thanks. Amy, also congratulations. Wish you all the best. We overlapped very briefly many years ago at a law firm. It was great to work with you there, and it's been just a pleasure to work with you in your various roles here at the Commission. Today also marks the last open meeting for our trio of summer law clerks. Constance Ricketts, Elizabeth Brown, and Connor Glisson have been great additions to the office. Constance is a recent graduate of the Catholic University of America Law School, my alma mater. So we should congratulate her not only for her graduation, but for recently taking the Maryland bar exam. Elizabeth, being from Norway, brought a unique perspective to the office as we worked on a lot of efforts at the FCC designed to win the race to 5G. There were some questions about her allegiances along the way, but thankfully she did pitch in a lot of the good work that we did in those proceedings. And for Connor, it took us until his last week in the office to discover his true talent, which is reciting the names of reality TV shows based in Alaska. I'll be in Alaska with Senator Sullivan next week for work, and as we were preparing for the trip, Connor ably rattled off about a half dozen of those reality TV shows that he wants us to try to investigate while we're up there. But in all seriousness, we will miss this hard-working group. We wish them all the best in their future endeavors. And finally, I want to announce that there's one addition to the office, Dana Howe, who's our new staff assistant. She joins our office from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, where she served as assistant to the bureau chief, and she's actually worked at the FCC since 1991. So thank you for all your service and for joining the office. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And we'll go now back to Commissioner O'Reilly.
As we're saying goodbye to interns, I want to thank and say goodbye to Emily Kaditz of our office, who's been working this year. She's going to be a 3L this fall. She's originally from Seattle. She's at the University of Colorado Law School, part of Phil Weiser's team on Silicon Flatirons, and she's had the opportunity to work on KidVid to 911 feed aversion and writing memos, letters, and everything in between. And we're going to miss her work, and we can't thank her enough for all that she did this year. And my last point, and I promise, is that everyone should have a good summer.
Hear, hear. I just have a few announcements. Before I get to those, I want to say thank you so much to Amy for your service to Commissioner O'Reilly and to the Commission generally. We certainly wish you well in your future endeavors, and to the extent that your name is an anagram for meander by, we hope you will keep in touch early and often, despite your departure. Also to Travis, congratulations on the twins. Two-touch make ready, you might call it, which is going to be a very difficult challenge in the time to come, but we're sure he's up to the challenge as well. Also, we have a few departures from the Commission staff. Ed Mantiply, I believe Ed is here. Is that right? Afraid the protocol is for you to stand up, brother, so we can scrutinize you. Ed is a physical scientist in the Office of Engineering and Technology, and he's retiring at the end of this month after 42 years in government service, including the last 18 with the FCC. Ed is widely recognized around the world as one of the leading experts in radio frequency exposure and related issues. He's going to be sorely missed here at the Commission. I personally have enjoyed seeing him in the hallways every now and then. As I understand it, Ed plans to spend time with his family after retirement, but we hope, nonetheless, he will stay in touch with us and darken our door. Ed, thank you for your long service to the U.S. government. Next, Marybeth Murphy, who I see over there. It is a sad thing that we have to say goodbye to the Deputy Chief of our Media Bureau after more than 23 years at the FCC, which is remarkable considering she must have been in kindergarten when she started. Marybeth began her career at the FCC here in the Office of General Counsel, and later stops included serving as acting legal advisor to the great Chairman Bill Kennard and Chief of the Media Bureau's Policy Division before being named Media Bureau Deputy Chief in 2016. She is the recipient in 2011 of the Commission's Gold Medal Award for Distinguished Service. I got to know her when I was in the Office of General Counsel, and I was always amazed at the thoroughness and collegiality she brought to our joint labors on media relation issues. For those who wish to continue to stay in touch with Marybeth, send her a friend request, and we congratulate you and thank you for your service to the Commission. Next, Madeline Finley. I don't know if Madeline is here. Okay, she is not, but nonetheless, we are sad to announce that she is leaving the Wireline Competition Bureau. Madeline is our fantastic deputy, one of the fantastic deputy bureau chiefs in the bureau. She left the agency on July 25th. She joined the commission in 2014 as Associate General Counsel in the Commission's Office of General Counsel, and since June of 2015, she's been in the WCB's front office as a deputy, handling a wide range of very complex and challenging issues, from the Restoring Internet Freedom proceeding to reforms of the E-rate program and numerous transactions. Madeline, as those of you who know her, both inside and outside the agency, will attest, she is a fantastic lawyer, brings tremendous energy and professionalism to the task at hand, and also has a very compelling wit. We wish her the very best in her new venture, which I believe is in the upper Midwest in Minnesota. And Madeline, wherever you are, thank you for the work you have rendered to this commission. Another departure, Charlie Meisch, who I believe is here. Yes, the always dapper Mr. Meisch is back. He joined the FCC in 2015, and he left in June of 2018, but he's back as an encore. He worked at the FCC as Senior Advisor for Policy and Communications for the Incentive Auction Task Force. He also provided strategic counsel to the Office of Media Relations here at the Commission. He also served as a Policy and Outreach Advisor in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau's Office of the Bureau Chief, focusing primarily on the FCC's groundbreaking work on extending universal service funding for rural broadband deployment. Now, I have it on good authority that his proudest work and accomplishment at the FCC was explaining the most complicated spectrum auction ever held, not just to the press corps, to Congress, to anyone who was interested, but also to local and regional folks who typically don't cover the FCC and wanted to know about how this auction was going to impact consumers and change wireless services. And I always thought that was a critical part of our public service, explaining what the agency does to folks who may not labor in the code of federal regulations every single day. Also, he helped the Commission in a successful effort to win the Franz Edelman Award for Excellence in Operations Research, which is no small thing. It was not a given that we would win this award, but thanks to Charlie's efforts, our fantastic Incentive Auction Task Force team won this over a lot of deserving other teams. His role there was to make the abstraction of this complicated auction understandable and relatable to the judges who would ultimately award the prize, and we did it, which I think is the perfect capstone for his time at the Commission. He's now at SKD Knickerbocker as a Vice President and Technology Counsel. Charlie, thank you for all that you've done for the Commission, and Godspeed in the exciting times ahead. Last but not least in our office, so we have two unfortunate departures, Kevin Costello, who left last Friday, and Justin McEwen, who's leaving tomorrow. Justin, I believe, is here. Our clerks were just fantastic this summer. We really enjoyed having them around. We threw them right into the maw of some of the most difficult things we had to do. It was nary a staff meeting that would go by when Justin and or Kevin wouldn't say, well, I'm doing research on X, writing a statement for X or Y. They did just a terrific job. But I think perhaps their greatest accomplishment was securing for our office for, I believe, the second year in a row that we've participated in the FCBA Trivia Night, the championship, which is something that we treasure. Kevin, thank you so much. And Justin, thank you as well for the great work you did in our office. And do stay in touch in the time to come. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Wednesday, September 26, 2018.
With that, we are adjourned.
To the open meeting press conference. Chairman Pai is going to deliver some opening remarks and then take some questions. So at this point, I'll turn the floor over to him.
All right, thank you, Ms. Pelkey, and good afternoon. Our August meeting always feels like the last day of school, so I'll try to keep this brief. 5 months ago, when the FCC modernized its rules governing wireless infrastructure, I stood at this very podium and I explained how the FCC had taken important steps to promote the 5G networks of the future. 2 months ago, when the FCC finalized rules for the use of the 24 gigahertz band, on top of proposing to free up even more spectrum in both the 26 and 42 gigahertz bands, I stood at this very podium and declared that the FCC had taken important steps to promote U.S. leadership in 5G. 3 weeks ago, when the Commission advanced a plan to make more intensive use of the airwaves from 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, what's commonly called the C-band. I stood at this very podium and declared that the FCC had taken important action to promote 5G development. And moments ago, the FCC voted to finalize the rules for the auction of airwaves in the 28 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz bands. We also took an important step toward holding a single auction in the second half of 2019 of the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands, in addition to advancing a federal one-touch make-ready policy that will make it quicker and cheaper to attach fiber for backhaul, among other things, to utility poles and to further build out networks. These are all important steps towards promoting U.S. leadership in 5G. So you may be detecting a pattern here. I hope that 2018 will be remembered as the summer of 5G at the FCC. Experts often point to the FCC's early movement on the 700 megahertz auction as key to U.S. leadership in 4G LTE development. Years from now, I expect the United States will be leading the world in 5G innovation, and I wouldn't be surprised if the many steps the Commission has taken this summer will be seen as a key reason why. And that is certainly the message I've heard from many of my counterparts around the world, judging from recent exchanges. Thanks for this accomplishment is due entirely to the FCC's hardworking staff who helped to make this progress possible. I also particularly want to thank my wireless advisor, Rachel Bender, who spearheaded many of these items in our office while she was getting ready to have a baby. And once again, we congratulate her and her husband on welcoming Joshua to the world last month. That is it from me, so I would open the floor up to your questions.
Margaret?
Hey, Margaret McGill.
Sitting in the Monty chair. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, I caught him, actually. No, just kidding.
Controversial.
All right.
Thank you,
Has the White House, anyone in the White House contacted you or your staff about the Sinclair Tribune merger?
No one in the White House has contacted us to express a view about the merger.
What about to ask any questions?
Oh, sorry.
Monty, go ahead.
Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Can you tell us when you decided to issue the HTO and what sparked that decision?
I'm not going to comment on our decision-making process other than to stand by the statement I made on July 16th and the hearing designation order that issued, I believe, on July 18th.
Next question, go ahead.
What does the Incubator Program mean for the Prometheus radio case, and can you comment on that now that it might move forward?
In terms of the impact on litigation, I would defer to our Office of General Counsel to express any view that they might wish to express on it. I'll simply say that as a matter of policy, we believe it is long past time for the FCC to take action to promote diversity of ownership in the broadcast business. As I mentioned in my statement, this is something that I supported 4 years ago that was specifically rejected 4 years ago, and I'm pleased that working together with public interest advocates, we were able to once and for all make a stand in favor of diversity in terms of official action.
Kelsey, go ahead.
Hi, Chairman Pai.
Hi.
Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I was wondering if you could comment on a class action lawsuit that was filed this week in which Sinclair, Tribune, and some other stations were accused of tying their advertising prices. I was wondering if, first of all, you've been following this case and whether that's something that came up in the FCC's inquiry.
I have not been following the case, and I certainly haven't read the complaint, so I can't express an opinion on pending litigation like that. Sorry.
John, go ahead.
Hey, John Hendel with Politico. Last week, Sinclair Chairman David Smith had met with Senator Thune to talk a little bit about the HDO, and apparently was a little bit upset about that. I wondered has Senator Thune reached out to talk to you about that, or have you spoken about that in the last week or so?
I have not spoken to Senator Thune.
Thank you.
I'm not going to ask you about Sinclair.
About the Jetsons picture that Kelsey found, that was spectacular work on the fly.
Commissioner Rosenworcel had expressed some concern about the effect of the preemption in the one-touch make-ready order, and specifically mentioned Myrtle Beach, which has apparently certain times of the year where they feel that it's not a good time to be digging up the roads and disturbing the traffic. Do you have any comment as to whether your understanding of the preemption that you've taken would apply in cases like that?
I'm not going to express a view on that particular case, not having studied the full facts of that particular case, but what I will say is that Section 253 affords the FCC ample authority under both the plain terms of the statute as well as the spirit of Congress that is clearly embodied in that section, and so I'm quite confident that both in terms of legal authority, but also in terms of policy, the steps we have taken are appropriate and necessary to promote greater broadband deployment and digital opportunity for all Americans, including in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
Okay, Howard Busker, Communications Daily. Since it is the summer of 5G, and this auction software was mentioned several times today, and I wanted to ask, what's the status of FCC efforts to update the software? Because I understand that maybe some fixes have already been made, and also, do you consider it possible to auction small blocks of spectrum as small as, say, counties or census tracts?
With respect to the latter, if you're talking about the 3.5 gigahertz band, Commissioner O'Reilly has made his recommendations, and we're currently studying the appropriate.
I was just asking generically about the size. How small can you go? So.
It just depends on the particular band that we're talking about. So I can't. There's no optimal answer that applies to every single band, I would say. With respect to the first. We have received additional funding through a reprogramming request from both the Senate and the House that will allow us to make upgrades to our information technology systems. And so that's one of the things we're going to be looking at is updating the auction software as we can.
Hi, Toby from Policy Tracker. You talk about US 5G leadership. Do you think it would benefit from the spectrum auction timetable that Commissioner Rosenworcel was talking about?
The auction timetable that we have announced is the one that will promote U.S. leadership in 5G. Some of the proposals that others have suggested would end up delaying the auctions substantially. For example, just moments ago, we voted on a proposal with respect to the 37 gigahertz band. That band, as I pointed out in my statement, is not currently ready for auction because there are incumbents there, and we need to have a market mechanism in order to facilitate the auction of that band. So tying everything together would require effectively delaying all auctions, in this case, until the end of 2019.
But would it be good just to have a document that would have like a list of, in 2019 that auction, 2020 that auction?
The document could be a transcription of my remarks, which is November 14th, the 28 gigahertz auction will start. It followed immediately thereafter by the 24 gigahertz auction. In the second half of 2019, we'll have auctions of the upper 37, 39, 47. And in addition to that, I've also publicly stated that we intend to move in the near future on 6 gigahertz spectrum. Additionally, Commissioner O'Reilly has been leading the charge on 3.5 gigahertz spectrum. So that's I think we've been quite clear on our timetable and on the aggressive actions that are necessary to promote U.S. leadership in 5G.
Hi, Casey Egan with S&P Global Market Intelligence. What role do you think the FCC can play in the ongoing debate about global data privacy regulations, especially given that the FCC's previous privacy order was overturned?
The Federal Trade Commission is the top cop on the beat when it comes to privacy, and so I would certainly refer you in the first instance to Chairman Joe Simons and some of the work he is doing in terms of privacy. Of course, members of Congress as well have been engaged deeply on these issues, and for our part as well, we're constantly monitoring these issues and look forward to working with the FTC and any other interested stakeholders on the appropriate way to protect consumers in a consistent way, especially in the online environment.
We'll go to the table. Does anyone have a question? Ted?
Ted Johnson from Variety. Can you envision a scenario where the FCC actually would take a look at Sinclair's existing licenses, especially if the administrative judge says that they were less than forthcoming in some of their merger documents?
Congressman Pallone asked me a related question at our most recent oversight hearing, and the answer I gave to him is the one I would have to give to you, that the answer to that question is, in my view, inextricably intertwined with some of the matters that have been referred to the administrative law judge. That ALJ process being a restricted proceeding, I can't opine upon the merits of it beyond the statement I gave and the terms of the HDO itself.
John, did you have a question?
John Reed with Bloomberg BNA. Do you have any updates on timing for the 6 gigahertz band? Any specific months? I mean, why is it taking it longer for the 6 gigahertz band to be going up before the commission compared to the C band?
So we have been working very aggressively with our staff and with other federal partners to figure out how quickly we can move. I can tell you that this has been a top priority for us, and I can't give you a specific time frame, except to say that, as I did in my most recent statement, we hope to be able to move in the near future. And of course, there are 4 months left in the year, so I would anticipate it's going to be one of those 4 months.
Next question. Hi, Victoria Turner with Par Global.
Hi.
I wanted to see if the ALJ has given a timeline yet for the hearing.
My recollection from the HDO, but I obviously can refer you to the HDO for the particular time frame. I remember there was a 15-day timeline that is dependent on the scheduling of appearances, if I remember correctly, but I can't give you the specific date. It's in the HDO how that
7th,
time frame is determined.
Kara Carlson with Reuters. Going back to President Trump's Sinclair tweet, do you consider that an attack on FCC's independence in any way?
I will simply say what I said to Congress, which is that I stand by our decision, and we looked at the facts, applied the law, as we do in any transaction.
Any other questions?
All right, thanks. Have a good summer.
This concludes the Chairman's open meeting press conference, and I'll invite my colleague Mark Wickfield to come up for the Bureau press conference.
Okay, so the first two items are from the Wireless Bureau, the auctions. If I have questions, yes, we have questions on the auctions. So. Howard, go ahead.
I guess I should wait till the rest of the team gets up there because these are pretty hard questions. I'm just teasing. I just wanted to ask, in the press release it talks about how it would a pre-auction voucher exchange that would allow incumbent licenses to consolidate and rationalize their holdings before the auction. And I think that was the thing that Commissioner Rosenworcel was talking about. Is that a change from the proposal? And I guess that's what I was just trying to get at, because I understood there were a few changes from what was originally proposed, but I was just looking a little bit on that and any color you have on that.
Changes from the draft.
From the
that was
draft,
released.
yeah.
There were no significant substantive changes. There were some changes in the text that were made to clarify the proposals based on questions that were raised by parties that came in to discuss with staff the proposal and try to better understand it. So they were simply clarifications.
Oh, so the draft largely is as written, but just with okay, all right.
Yeah, that's
Thank
correct.
you.
Yes.
I wonder if you could maybe explain or clarify about this three-tiered process for upfront payments. Is that something new, and how does it work? What does it achieve?
So the three-tiered approach to upfront payments and minimum opening bids, that was something that we looked at based on some comments on the record, proposals in the record, and the idea would be that for larger markets, you would start with a higher megahertz pops price, and for smaller markets, you would start with a lower megahertz price, and the idea would be potentially, it's sort of a balancing and trying to start bidding at a place where folks are going to enter into the auction and we'll have competition for the bidding.
Okay. And is this a new? Is this something that the FCC has done before?
Want to come up to?
Yeah.
I mean, to some extent on the incentive auction.
Yes, to some extent.
I'd say conceptually
Right.
we have,
Yeah.
perhaps not precisely like this, but I think conceptually we've done things like this.
Yeah, and more graduated changes. I mean, rather than these big categories, we've had a smoother change in weights, so to speak.
I'm sorry, can you just, I probably regret asking this question, but can you give like a past auction where where you use something similar, but this is a variation on that. Can you just cite to like one of the past auctions?
It was 600.
Broadcast incentive
Yeah,
auction.
the broadcast incentive auction, the forward part of that.
Okay.
We used weighted pops, and they were weighted by different prices depending on the size of the market. So.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great. Anything? One more?
Yeah, only one more. Just want to understand, what is there in the rules that stops, on the 39 gigahertz auction, what is there that stops someone with an incumbent license from bidding on that auction to inflate the price of the voucher that they're going to receive? And then they could sell that voucher, or they can get cash for that voucher, as I understand, after the auction if they wish to leave.
So, I mean, what we have in the NPRM is a proposal. We're seeking comment on a number of different things and different options. But I think the concept would be that if the incumbent starts bidding up the prices, they do run the risk that they're not going to be able to drop out and are going to get stuck with additional licenses. So it's kind of a balancing that they have to approach.
Right. And they will, I mean, an incumbent that backs out of or drops out of a market will be paid at the highest price for the PEA, basically for the blocks of the PEA, regardless of whether they're the ones who run up the price or, yeah, and they run the risk of not being able to collect any sort of payment and holding the license still. So.
Thank you very much. The next item is the wireline infrastructure item. Are there questions on that item? Yes, Lynn has a question. So Wireline Bureau, please. And wireless. I'm sorry, there may be some wireless questions on that one as well.
Oh, Chris.
You're not alone, Adam.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi there.
Lynn?
Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. The press release refers to the preemption part of it being done on a case-by-case basis. Would the commission be waiting for someone to bring forward some kind of a complaint before it would act? Or do you want to address that?
Sure. The declaratory ruling sets forth the commission's interpretation of Section 253A through C, and then sets forth how the commission views those provisions in terms of their effect. So I'd refer you to the text when it comes out for additional detail on that point.
But I mean, just in terms of, do you view it as, I don't see how it could be self-effectuating. It's going to take some further action by the FCC in any individual case, right?
Yes, that's appropriate. That's correct.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, for example, what happens in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina to the regulation that Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned? Does it just cease to exist, or is there going to be some kind of FCC challenge process there?
We can't opine upon a specific set of facts that we haven't reviewed, but it does remain the case that Section 253D petitions can be filed.
I have a question. Howard Busker from Communications Daily. I had a question on the moratoriums or moratoria, and that's how does that compare to the current state of play at the FCC in terms of the rules? Because I think there's a couple of people had said, well, there's already sort of moratoria and that kind of thing, but how does this go beyond what the FCC had in place?
You mean in terms of the wireless?
Just in general, I mean, I'm not,
So Matthew, I think our colleagues from the Wireless Bureau probably could answer that question a little bit better than we could.
Probably.
But there are, and Don, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there are shot clocks already established in the wireless citing that moratoria cannot go beyond those shot clocks. So that's already a prohibition that is in place. This is extending that and applying to all moratoria, whether it's in the wireless context or in the wireline context.
So it's broader than...
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
And it's using our 253A authority. The Wireless Bureau, when in previous items, has relied on Section 332. Okay. This is primarily under 253.
Thank you.
Okay. Is that it? All right, thank you very much. Also, Wireline, other questions on the telehealth item? Okay. Then those two Media Bureau items, the translator and the incubator. Are there questions? Monty, there are questions on that. So Media Bureau. Go ahead.
When does the program actually start? Does it start immediately or is it delayed?
The Incubator Program? Well, we have to publish our order in the Federal Register, and usually that takes 30 days after publication to become effective, and I assume that after that we can start accepting applications. PRA approval, right, by OMB, which can take up to 6 months.
Go ahead, Monty.
Commissioner O'Reilly mentioned that there's transferability has been included in the order. Is there any restrictions on that? Can you talk about? Can you just if you're granted the waiver, it just goes on forever, or is there any other sort of restriction on that?
I don't.
So, I mean, I defer you to the item, which hopefully will be out today. But essentially, it can be transferred in combination with the existing cluster. So, if the incumbent broadcaster incubates and uses a waiver and takes them above the cap, it won't lose the benefit of that combination if it's sold intact, and that will transfer with if that cluster is subsequently sold intact. The waiver benefit will travel with the cluster.
But if you split it up.
Correct.
Okay. And then there was a lot of requests, and I think Commissioner O'Reilly mentioned some of this, but there were a lot of requests to add language about this going to TV next. Did any of that make it into the final item?
There were some modest word changes, but the most fundamental change was regard to the transferability.
Okay, and then he also mentioned the request that there be some sort of acknowledgement that Congress should pass a tax credit. He said he didn't like it. He also said that adding that would slow the incubator process down. Can you have any explanation about how the FCC working Congress would slow down the process of the progress of the incubator thing?
I think you'll have the opportunity to ask him next.
I can do that. And some of the opponents of the comparable markets thing that got left in were saying that leaving it in would be a disincentive to establishing incubator programs in some of the larger markets. Do you guys have any response to that?
I mean, I think our ultimate goal was to make sure that there's flexibility for there to be, between the incubator and the incubatee, and we made the decision, as a line drawing exercise, we made the decision this would preserve the most flexibility.
All right, that's all I got on the incubator. I don't know if anyone else. I have some stuff on repacking.
Kelsey, if you want to go ahead.
So I have two questions about the incubator program. First of all, just to follow up to make sure I understand the way this transfer would work. If a station is sold as part of a cluster, that means the station is essentially a freebie and then it doesn't count over the cap even if it's sold?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. I also wanted to ask if there is a purchase option for the incubated station, or will the incubator station have the ability to purchase the incubated station afterward?
Sorry, I got tangled in the incubator.
It's just about an option, but can they purchase it?
If the party that is being incubated at the end of the term, it has the option to buy out its investor and stand alone as a 100% independent owner.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
Okay,
thanks.
Monty, did you have some others?
Yeah, on the repacking thing. Does it include any? There was a request that it include some language about reimbursement for microwave relay transmitters. I'm going to mess this up, but I think it's the Mojave request. Did that get in there in the final NPRM? Or yeah.
I think you'll have to wait to read the final order.
Oh, suspenseful. And also, Commissioner O'Reilly mentioned educational outreach as something that you guys had worked with them on. Can you say how it ended up with on educational outreach? Are there policies in there, or just questions seeking comment on how outreach should be done? Or
again, I would urge you to ask Commissioner O'Reilly about that, but there were some changes made to the wording of the consumer education paragraph.
Okay. That's all I got.
Anything further? All right, and with that, Commissioner O'Reilly is here.
Hello, everyone. Start down here.
Yeah, well, I was just asking them about the incubator thing. You said that
program?
The program.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good word for it. You said that that you didn't want it to include language about pressuring Congress to do a tax certificate program, and you said that would slow down the process somehow. Can you explain how that would slow down the incubator process or diversity or?
Sure. Legislation often takes a little bit of time.
Okay.
And so if it was a punt, which has been the recommendation from the initial recommendation from the advisory committee to basically tie it to Congress passing legislation, that legislation would likely take a little bit longer time than we were able to do with this project. So that was my point. I also think there's disagreements. I disagree with the tax program. A lot of people will disagree with the tax program. It's not something that will fly through in the immediate. So I think that's where I was getting to the point of slowing it down.
Okay.
Hi, Commissioner. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I wanted to ask if maybe you could address Commissioner Rosenworcel's comment about the this program possibly cutting into Lifeline. Sorry, the Telehealth program cutting into Lifeline. Is there a way in which it would, and how is this funding mechanism going to work?
Yeah, thanks. So we were really excited about launching this NOI and the difference that it can make. One of the things we see comment on is the funding for it. The idea that we have in the item is about a new one-time $100 million budgeting, which would come just like any other sort of new budgeting would come through the Universal Service Program.
So would that in any way take away from Lifeline or existing programs? I guess I'm just kind of wondering where the money would be coming from.
No, the proposal is not to have this $100 million come out of the existing Lifeline budget. The proposal is that we would newly budget to account for this $100 million program.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question for Commissioner O'Reilly. Hi, Casey Egan with S&P Global Market Intelligence. Does the Commission's referral of the proposed Sinclair Tribune merger for review to an ALJ in any way change your view that the Commission should dump the ALJ process?
I want to be careful on the first part since we have been made clear what we can't talk about. But I'll just say my views on the ALJ in total have not changed. The fact that we've, in my statement to the item, which is public, made clear that we may be providing a hint of more due process that does not address the fundamental problems, in my viewpoint, that still apply to the ALJ process today.
Thank you.
Okay, if we're skipping around, I wanted to, I thought we were formally going down the row.
There's a pattern here. You just haven't.
Okay, I guess, now I'm seeing it. So. I just had a question. I had a question on auction software because the chairman just said that there's money for that, so they're working on some upgrades. And I guess my question is, what would you both like to see in terms of updates to auction software? And do you think it's going to be, will it ever be possible to sell spectrum in really small blocks, not specific to any proceeding that's before you right now?
Sure. So I don't know what the reprogramming funding and how much that is that the chairman referenced. So I don't know how much money we're talking about, whether that will defeat the purpose. But I've made the point that our auction software cannot address some of the smaller license sizes that you mentioned, geographic license sizes, where you don't have the capability of doing, for instance, on 3.5, we do not have the capability of auctioning 74,000 licenses times 7 licenses in terms of actually having an auction. What was contemplated and never was the unspoken message from the previous administration, the previous commission, was it was going to be a sealed bid and not an actual auction that that we envisioned. They called it an auction, but it was not an auction, and I made that point to Congress when we last testified, I think a week and a half ago or so. So that is not an auction, in my opinion. I would like to see the software capable of auctioning all the bands that we seem necessary and as many licenses as we seem appropriate, depending on the circumstances. We don't have that today. And so that's why the question, I think, was previously asked to me, what about 37, 39, and 47? It also matters, how many, I think Paul had asked me the question previously, how come that we can do those 3 together? And it's because the number of markets that were actually in licenses were actually auctioning off are much smaller than 74,000, for instance. So it's the number of market areas that are being auctioned off that matter and what our capabilities are today, from my understanding from talking to the auction people. And we should have a much greater command and ability than we do today.
And just to be clear, so under the proposal that is the current rules, because the rules have to be changed, there wouldn't be an actual Pell's auction. It would just be people
sealed bids.
And then they would be compared, and then
we would just take the top one and whatever envelope we picked up for that particular market. From what I understand, the process was going to be. It was not an auction as you envision the FCC auction software, where we would have a comprehensive ability to compete and see as prices change that we'd be able to. An entity would be able to bid up to where they thought where they would like to go. It was a one-time sealed bid. But I don't know if it was software or paper done, but it was not going to be an auction as we've come to know since Commissioner Roosevelt also mentioned the 1993 auction approval from Congress.
And you're just directly opposed to that concept, right? As opposed to
we should have auctions have proven to be the best way to award licenses, and I think that a multi-round auction is a much better way than a sealed bid auction by far, and that's what we do and almost have done and should do going forward.
Thank you. In regard to the Section 253 preemption and the declaratory ruling, Commissioner Rosenworcel had brought up an example in Myrtle Beach where there's, as she described it, there's weather and sort of public safety issues related to certain times of the year. What kind of response do you have to those concerns?
Well, I wasn't quite. I didn't follow her argument exactly because to the 250.
You mentioned hurricanes, so I assume
I get it, and I'm not criticizing. I just didn't quite get it. I figured I'd follow up at some point because I don't see where that would be a moratorium. I don't see where they would say we're not going to make a decision for X amount of time until we set some rules. If I understood her analogy or at least example, there actually were rules at certain times you couldn't do X, Y, or Z. That's different than a moratorium where we're not going to make rules for a year until we think it's best. We're not going to make rules until you do X, Y, or Z for us.
Just so I'm sure that I'm understanding your distinction. So you're saying rather than a period of time from this point forward, whether it's a year or however long, you see that as distinct from an ongoing rule that says we're not going to talk about this for this 3 months. We're not going to let you do, or we're not going to let you do this during these 3 months of the year or 4 months or whatever.
And I don't want to, again, I don't know the experiences the example we're talking about, so I don't know the particulars. But there may be other provisions in our rule that prevent such a ruling or those rules to be in effect for whatever reason that they may be anti-competitive. There are different ways that those rules may be in place. But in terms of a moratorium, I don't see how that matches up with a moratorium in my view.
Thank you. Commissioner Carr, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, also we say, when you look at the statutory language in 253, Congress made a decision there about prohibitions and effective prohibitions are not lawful, and this decision applies that and updates that with respect to moratoria, either express moratoria or de facto moratoria, and it ties it to the existing standard that Congress set out there. So if there is a locality that has a moratoria or a de facto moratoria that operates as an effective prohibition, all the decision is saying is Congress said that that's unlawful.
Would you consider something that applies to a certain segment of the year to be a moratoria if it's if so every year they say we can't let you do these things during this time period because of whatever issues they might have locally.
Yeah, ultimately the question comes down to the statutory language and whether it's operating as a prohibition or an effective prohibition. And again, remember, there's sort of two separate things in this space oftentimes, which is sort of the acceptance of the application and the processing of the application and decisions on the application. And there can be scheduling issues down the road with respect to actual deployment. And the question through all of that is, are those operating as effective prohibitions or not?
But what a prohibition is in your mind, is that a permanent thing that says you can never do it, or is a prohibition something that might restrict you from doing it during some certain time?
Again, there's the processing side, and then there's the scheduling of the deployment side, and it's always going to come down to a question about whether it operates as an effective prohibition, and we would leave it to that statutory standard to dictate the outcome.
Okay.
Before you ask your wife, I just wanted to ask a follow-up on the moratoria. Is it your opinion that I know that some of the people, the local government people, weren't all that worked up about the moratoria because they were saying, well, there's already restrictions, especially in wireless. There's the shot clocks. Is it your feeling that this does advance the ball to any? I mean, to what extent does this sort of advance the ball to now have this moratorium in place?
Yeah, I would say it doesn't break a tremendously amount of new ground to the extent that the Commission has said, as Commissioner O'Reilly said, I think 3 times in a row, that it's long been the view of the FCC, we've said it time and time again, that moratoria operate as either a prohibition or effective prohibition under the statute. We've sometimes talked about it in a 332 sense. We've sometimes talked about it in a 253 sense. And so it's not breaking new ground in that sense. But we have seen, notwithstanding past pronunciations, instances of moratoria going into place. And so I do think, while this may not break a tremendously amount of new ground, it's helpful for us to reemphasize the point, particularly as we look to 5G deployments.
Toby from Policy Tracker. I guess this is a question for Commissioner O'Reilly more than Carr, but I'd obviously be happy to hear your thoughts. You mentioned the complexity of the incentive idea for 39 gigahertz. Do you think this incentive auction is going to work in getting rid of the incumbent licenses and making fresh 5G licenses, if you like? Do you think it's going to be successful?
No, I think it absolutely can be successful. I think it raises a bunch of issues, and we're to comment on those and make the best decision. I think there's ways to simplify it, and I think we can do that, and it can work. It like I said, I provided an example in monopoly context. Some people didn't appreciate that, but I think there is definitely a way to make this happen, and I look forward to that the comments in the coming months.
And any way to make it happen that you'd want to highlight?
I want to see where the comments come in and the procedures.
I was going to ask if both of you could tell us when you learned about the hearing designation order and how early you learned about it, that it was coming. Was it when it was circulated, or was it before that?
I think they were really close to the time frame.
Okay, like that weekend.
I think that. I'm trying to figure out what we're allowed to say about this, so I don't want to get out.
Just say everything.
Yeah.
So if my memory is right, it was circulated on a Monday morning.
Yeah, I think that.
And I found out about it either at or around the time of the circulation of the document.
I agree with that.
Okay. And you had no reason to think such a thing was coming ahead of that. Silence means assent.
Okay, I think I said what I said in my statement. I wasn't part of the conversations that were had.
Right.
And so when an item is presented to me, I look at it, I read it, I digest it, and I try to vote expeditiously.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Any other questions for? All right. Okay, there we go.
There's a recent round of consultation that finished on Legado's application to use 40 megahertz of the L band for terrestrial services. Well, do you have any views on that? Are you encouraging this?
I think the chairman's probably in the best position to answer that. I don't have any updates to provide on the topic.
Okay.
Is there a question? You're good? I thought you're good. Okay. John Donnelly. No, John. Okay, someday. Bring back, right?
All right, good times. How can I help you? Go ahead.
Hi, Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. In your testimony to Congress, you mentioned that there might be a reason to question Sinclair's existing licenses, or at least it seemed like maybe that was what you were alluding to. Could you break down those comments a little bit more?
If I recall, I was asked a question during testimony last week. And to the best of my recollection, it was about whether or not issues of candor or misrepresentation for licensees could be an issue outside of a hearing designation order. Under Section 308 of the Communications Act, there are technical, financial, and character qualifications for licensees. So this does speak to that character element, and that's why I acknowledged that issues of candor and misrepresentation can have broader consequences during the license renewal process.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question. One of the things the chairman was asked about 6 gigahertz, and he said basically, well, most likely there'll be something by the end of the year. It could be any of the 4 months, left. Do you feel that the commission is making progress? You complained a lot that there wasn't a specific calendar, and do you believe that the commission's making progress in that area? Or do you believe that there's still a lot more that could be done to sort of lay out what the timetable is going to be on 5G and various auctions and that kind of thing?
Sure, that's a great question. The entire wireless ecosystem, from consumers to wireless companies to equipment manufacturers, those who make antennas, everyone would be better served if this agency had a public schedule for spectrum auctions. All we have now is a blitz of bands under consideration. I mean, I can rattle them all off for you, but I will spare you the fact that I've committed them to memory. There are just a lot of them under consideration contemporaneously. We should organize our energies and focus on those that are coming first and make public to everyone in a transparent fashion, which will be resolving first.
And then also follow up on something Commissioner O'Reilly talked about. He said that basically the plan for the 3.5 gigahertz band wasn't to have an auction with traditional, auction software. That it was just a series of sealed bids. And he had concerns about that. And I wanted to ask you about that because I know you're a strong advocate of the 3.5, and I think maintaining the census tracks.
2 things. First, we need to auction some mid-band spectrum. Other countries are far ahead of us. China, Italy, the UK, South Korea have all held auctions or planned ways to get mid-band spectrum to market this year. We still don't have anything on the books. Second, we have been kicking around the 3.5 gigahertz auction for more than 3 years at this point. We should be making a decision. And then finally, I just don't know how it is that software is eating the world and is a functional part of everything we do, but this agency can't figure out how to update its software to make our spectrum auctions more modern. And in the past, we figure out our policies first and then identify how to make our software accommodate them. Using software as an excuse to me strikes me as misguided and wrong and not particularly good for the future of spectrum policy. Lynn.
Tiardelli. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on your concerns about the preemption portion of the one-touch make-ready order. And in particular, is there some particular reason why you mentioned Myrtle Beach? Is it in the order, or has someone brought that idea of this? Maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but it sounded like you're talking about a partial year ban on digging up the streets, basically. Is that, if I got that right?
It's in our record, and it struck me as a good example. So much of what we do has sort of this legal abstraction. So let's look at how this is applied in a community. The decision today says, pursuant to Section 253A, you cannot have express moratoria or de facto moratoria. You can't even have time-limited moratoria. I think that's problematic because I think it's overbroad, and I think it reads out of the statute, Section 253D, which contemplates a case-by-case analysis of those kind of circumstances in states and localities. I think it also reads out of the statute, Section 337, which is very specific about wireless deadlines and wireless siting practices. So, all of that's kind of legalistic. What does it mean in the real world? Myrtle Beach is a beach town. It's got a tourist season. Its economy is dependent on it. It also has a hurricane season. And for a brief period of time, the city has a practice of saying, yep, you can't build because there's too great a risk to our economic health and to the public safety of those who live there. It doesn't seem like the craziest thing to allow municipalities to make decisions like that. What does seem crazy to me is that 3 people in Washington think they know better. I believe there is some way we can balance the interests of those localities and the knowledge about what happens in their backyard with our desire for national deployment. I just don't think that the order before us reached that balance correctly or appropriately.
Thank you.
Another question about what you mentioned in the Lifeline program and how the Telehealth program might somehow cut into that or affect it. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah. Oh boy, it's all statutory stuff. Okay. The healthcare program is designed for rural areas. You can look it up in the statute. Section 254H1 mentions that there are some areas in this country where serving rural healthcare providers, facilities, might be really expensive, and they might be substantially more expensive than the cost of serving urban areas in the same state. And it asked the FCC to use its universal service funds to pay for that delta and that difference. That's the first healthcare program that the FCC ever set up. Later, the FCC set up a program to support networks, and that was pursuant to Section 254H2, which also references healthcare provider facilities, and we set up a way to connect rural facilities with their urban counterparts. It was a little different from the other one. But if you look at the statutory language and both of the programs we created, what you'll see consistently is that they are for rural areas and they involve healthcare providers. Those are the 2 most essential criteria in both of those programs. Fair enough. But what we've proposed in this notice of inquiry, and granted it's a notice of inquiry, so these are early days, we've proposed something for low-income patients at home. It's not specifically rural, and it doesn't speak to service to facilities. So you have to ask, what's the statutory authority for doing that? And if you comb through Section 254, what you will find is the only statutory authority available for doing that is the Lifeline Program. And my point was simply, before we take on a shiny new project and give out funds and accept accolades for it, we have to answer for the policies that we have put in motion that could destabilize the millions of people who rely on the Lifeline Program. Because late last year, this commission decided that we would gut that program and take it away from as many as 70% of current recipients. So I wanted to itemize some of the people we've destabilized. Veterans, the elderly, homeless youth. If you think about it, these are some of the very same people you might want to serve with this healthcare program. And I don't think it is prudent, smart, or wise for us to give out new funds without answering for how we've destabilized those communities with our reforms we propose for the Lifeline Program. Does that help?
Yes. I was wondering if you proposed any changes to the incubator order that weren't included or it didn't work out.
We had a lot of back and forth, and I know I dissented in the end, but I would appreciate that my colleagues entertained our ideas. But a few things. It's very hard to see the power of an incubator proposal when the agency has burned down virtually all of its media ownership rules. And while I agree the proposal that came up a long time ago was something that merited consideration, here What we do is so modest because we no longer have rules in place to even waive. And so I would dispute that this is effective or that it will materially make any change in women and minority ownership of broadcast stations. And I think my concerns are really fundamental. After you burn down all your rules, you cannot show up with an incubator and suggest that you're actually going to be making real change.
Thank you.
Hi, Commissioner Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. You talked about consequences for broadcasters who don't show candor or have a lack of candor. Can I draw you out on that a little bit? What are the consequences down the road if a broadcaster is found to lack candor before the FCC?
That is a requirement under Section 308, I believe, of the statute, and I believe those are issues that can come up at the time of license renewal.
So they could lose a license in the future, possibly?
I can't speak to anything that's before us right now. Over the long history of the FCC, those have been issues, but I will acknowledge not recently.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Victoria Turner with Park Global. Back to the character problem that you said, the character issue that you said with Sinclair. Wouldn't there be, with the class action, another one? I mean, would the ALJ actually take that into consideration during the hearing? Would there be a motion to enlarge?
I can't speak to that, I think, given the hearing designation order, but I can say in 1990, this agency issued a character policy statement. And you're testing me now, but if I recall, there were 3 things in the character policy statement. There was whether or not you complied with FCC law, whether or not you complied with the laws in the world at large, and whether or not you made substantial misrepresentations to this agency. Those were the 3 issues that came up in our character assessment. But I'd certainly encourage you to go back and look at that 1990 order and not just rely on my memory.
And one further question. You said that, sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
That's okay.
Sorry. When are the licenses up for renewal?
There are 8-year cycles that affect different states, and I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, Toby from Policy Tracker. Just to clarify something on timing on your statements on 24 and 28 gigahertz band. You were saying it'd be good to auction 24 and 28 alongside 37, 39, and 42. Are you saying that you would prefer 24 and 28 to be put back to next year, or do you reckon the problems, the issues at 39 gigahertz could be resolved in some other way that it could all be auctioned at the end of this year?
I just think it's axiomatic that organizing more substitutable or near substitutable spectrum in a single auction increases the likelihood of bidders, increases the ability of bidders to make real-time assessments about what licenses are available to them. I think it leads to a more successful auction. So I think that should be a priority in our thinking about the auctions in the future. All right, last one.
With the spectrum auctions, when it's my understanding that the bidders actually can't communicate between each other.
Yes.
What would happen with Sprint and T-Mobile?
I don't have an answer for you on that right now. I'll have my office follow up if you'd like.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, thank you.